Introduction: Perceptual Recursion, Engineering the Illusion of Reference. The journey we embark upon begins not in the external world, but within the subtle mechanics of your own apprehension. Consider, for a moment, the fundamental nature of your perceived reality. It is not merely observed, but deeply, intricately constructed. Every boundary, every definition, every sense of solidity you encounter springs from a confluence of internal processing and external stimuli. This intricate exchange, this constant recalibration, forms what we shall call a perceptual recursion, a looping feedback system where observation informs belief, and belief then filters subsequent observation, creating a self-reinforcing echo chamber of experience. This constant, often unconscious engineering process generates your baseline illusion. It is the operating system of your consciousness, quietly dictating the parameters of what is possible, what is real, what is even conceivable. Most exist within the confines of this default architecture, accepting its projections as immutable truth. Yet a profound liberation awaits those who choose to examine the very circuitry of this fabrication. This exploration is not an act of deconstruction for its own sake, but rather an invitation to mastery. We will systematically dismantle the components of this illusion, not to negate reality, but to reveal its underlying malleability. By understanding the forces that shape your perception, you begin to grasp the levers of its influence. This is the genesis of true agency. To move beyond being a passive recipient of a predefined world and to consciously engage in the precise calibration of your inner experience. This journey demands rigor, an unflinching gaze into the foundational assumptions that govern your existence. It promises not facile solutions, but a profound re-architecture of your engagement with all that is. Prepare to redefine the very act of seeing. Chapter 1. The Epistemic Barrier, Calibrating the Sensor-Emotor Interface. The reality we inhabit, the very ground upon which our lives unfold, presents itself with an undeniable solidity, an incontrovertible presence. We move through its contours, interacting with its textures, convinced of its objective, external existence. Yet this conviction, however comforting, rests upon a profound misunderstanding of the fundamental processes at play. What we apprehend as reality is not an unadulterated direct transmission from an external world, but rather an intricate, perpetually unfolding internal construct, a meticulously engineered baseline illusion woven by the very fabric of our being. This initial revelation, profound in its simplicity, marks the true beginning of our journey. Our exploration commences at the precipice of this understanding, with what we term the epistemic barrier. The interface where the undifferentiated energetic field of existence meets the specific, interpretive apparatus of human consciousness. It is here, at this sensory-cognitive frontier, that the universe, in its raw and boundless form, undergoes its initial transformative distillation into experience. This barrier is not an obstacle to be lamented, but rather the intrinsic mechanism through which our individual consciousness comes to know anything at all. Consider for a moment the seemingly straightforward act of perception. We believe we see the tree, hear the bird, feel the warmth of the sun. But these are not raw, unfiltered experiences. Each sensory modality operates as a highly specialized transducer, converting external energies into electrochemical signals that the brain can process. The eyes, for instance, respond only to a minuscule sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, a narrow band we term visible light. Photons strike retinal cells, initiating a cascade of chemical and electrical events. This is not seeing the photon, it is translating its energetic signature into a biological code. Beyond this narrow band lies a vast ocean of frequencies, radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, all propagating through the same space, yet utterly invisible, utterly imperceptible to our unassisted sight. Our visual field, therefore, is not a window onto totality, but a highly selective aperture, exquisitely tuned for survival within specific ecological parameters. Similarly, our auditory system captures pressure waves within a defined frequency range, translating vibrations in the air into the complex orchestration of sound. The ultrasonic calls of bats, the subterranean rumblings perceived by elephants, these entire auditory landscapes exist around us, vibrant and full, yet remain entirely beyond the threshold of human hearing. Our sense of touch translates pressure, temperature, and texture into neural impulses, yet ignores the constant barrage of neutrinos passing effortlessly through our bodies, leaving no trace upon our nervous system. Our olfactory and gustatory senses detect specific molecular configurations, interpreting chemical information into the rich tapestry of scent and taste. Yet the vast majority of chemical interactions in our environment remain unapprehended by these limited, though potent, biological filters. This initial layer of sensory filtration is the first, undeniable aspect of the epistemic barrier. Our physical senses do not passively receive reality, they actively sculpt it, selecting, amplifying, and transforming raw data into a specific, biologically relevant format. This transformation is not merely a reduction, but a profound recoding. The external world, as it is inherently unknowable in its pure form, for the very act of knowing it is predicated upon its translation into the language of our own biological hardware. Each species, each organism, thus inhabits a unique Umwelt, a subjective world of experience determined by its particular sensory apparatus. What we experience as a tangible, objective world is already, at this primary level, a highly specialized interpretation, a specific rendition of a reality far more expansive and undifferentiated than we can directly perceive. From these transformed sensory signals, the intricate work of the cognitive architect begins. The brain does not simply compile data, it builds, constructs, and perpetually revises a coherent, predictive model of the world. It takes the fragmented, coded impulses from the senses and weaves them into a continuous, immersive narrative. This process is not passive, it is intensely active, drawing heavily upon memory, past experiences, learned associations, emotional states, and pre-existing cognitive frameworks. Imagine the stream of data arriving at the brain as countless individual brushstrokes. The brain, as the artist, does not merely display these strokes, it interprets them, fills in the gaps, anticipates the next stroke, and ultimately renders a complete, meaningful painting. This involves sophisticated pattern recognition, where the brain constantly seeks familiarity, categorizing new input against a vast library of stored experiences. It employs predictive coding, generating hypotheses about incoming sensory data, and only updating its model when there is a significant discrepancy between prediction and actual input. This predictive capacity is profoundly efficient, allowing us to navigate complex environments with remarkable speed and accuracy. But it also means we are often perceiving not what is truly there, but what our brain expects to be there, based on its learned models. Consider the phenomenon of optical illusions, or the way our perception can be altered by suggestion or expectation. These are not flaws in the system, but rather profound demonstrations of the brain's active role in constructing reality. It is not merely a recorder of events, but a sophisticated editor, director, and narrator, constantly crafting a plausible story from inherently ambiguous sensory cues. The emotional valence we attach to an experience, the significance we imbue it with, is not inherent in the external event itself, but rather a product of our cognitive interpretation, shaped by our personal history, beliefs, and psychological state. Two individuals witnessing the exact same incident will inevitably walk away with two distinct experiences, not just because their sensory inputs might differ subtly, but primarily because their cognitive frameworks, their memories, biases, fears, hopes, and expectations will process and interpret that raw data through entirely different lenses. This synthesis of sensory transformation and cognitive construction forms the core of the epistemic barrier. It is the unyielding interface between the vastness of existence and the individualized reality of consciousness. This barrier defines the parameters of our immediate knowing. It delineates what can be apprehended and how it will be apprehended. It means that our experience of reality is fundamentally mediated, a representation rather than a direct apprehension of what is. The universe, in a sense, speaks to us through an interpreter, our own sensory cognitive interface, and it is the interpreter's rendition that we experience as truth. To acknowledge this barrier is not to succumb to solipsism, nor to deny the existence of an external reality. It is rather to understand the conditional nature of our access to it. It is to recognize that the objective world we perceive is, by its very definition, a phenomenal world filtered through our unique apparatus. This realization is liberating, for it shifts the locus of inquiry from a futile attempt to grasp an unmediated, external truth to a more profound understanding of the internal mechanisms by which our truth is constructed. Therefore, the imperative that arises from this understanding is one of calibration. To calibrate the sensory-cognitive interface means to become intimately acquainted with the specific biases, sensitivities, interpretive shortcuts, and default settings of your own perceptual system. It is an act of rigorous self-inquiry, a metacognitive exercise where you turn the lens of awareness inward, observing how you observe, understanding how you understand. Calibration is not an attempt to dismantle the barrier, for it is integral to our functional existence. Instead, it is about illuminating its architecture. It asks us to meticulously examine the assumptions we hold, the learned frameworks that shape our interpretations, the emotional states that color our perceptions, and the physiological nuances of our sensory organs. It means recognizing that what appears as an external fact might, in reality, be an internal projection, a deeply ingrained pattern recognition, or a consequence of a specific emotional state. This process involves a dispassionate observation of our own perceptual habits. When confronted with a situation, do we automatically categorize it based on past experiences, thereby precluding a novel interpretation? When we see injustice, are we perceiving the raw event, or are we filtering it through a deeply conditioned moral framework that might be specific to our cultural upbringing? When we feel joy or sorrow, how do these emotional states amplify or diminish certain sensory inputs, effectively reshaping the perceived reality around us? Calibrating the interface means becoming aware of these internal mechanisms, not to judge them, but to understand their operational parameters. It means cultivating a subtle discernment between the raw, coded sensory input and the layers of cognitive interpretation that are immediately superimposed upon it. It is about understanding that the noise in our perceived reality often originates not from external chaos, but from the unexamined operations of our own internal filters. This practice of conscious calibration moves us from being passive recipients of a predetermined reality to becoming active participants in its continuous construction. This is the foundational step. Without a clear understanding of how our sensory-cognitive interface operates, how it engineers the baseline illusion that constitutes our experienced reality, any further attempt to influence our lives or to navigate the deeper currents of existence will be akin to operating a complex, unknown machine in the dark. It is only by understanding the parameters of our own perceptual apparatus that we can begin to gain true mastery over our internal landscape, and by extension over our engagement with the phenomenal world. We begin here at this crucial juncture to reclaim intentional command over the very act of experiencing reality. Chapter 2. Systemic Entanglement, Mapping Internally Generated Friction. The finely calibrated interface, once recognized and observed, reveals its profound limitations. For the human experience, as explored, is not merely a reception of external phenomena, filtered and interpreted. It is, more acutely, a crucible where internal forces, often unseen, collide and refract, forging a persistent, insidious resistance. This is the systemic entanglement, not just the intricate network of our being, but specifically the state where the components of our inner world become inextricably intertwined, often in dissonance, generating a profound and pervasive, internally generated friction. This friction is the subtle drag on our consciousness, the unseen impediment to clarity and decisive action. It is not born of the world beyond our skin, but manufactured within the intricate machinery of our own cognition, emotion, and volition. It emerges from the unexamined operations of the self, a silent tremor beneath the surface of awareness, constantly siphoning energy and distorting our interaction with what is. At the heart of this entanglement lies the human faculty of judgment, what the Stoics termed prohairesis. This is our capacity for rational choice, for forming impressions and giving or withholding assent. Yet paradoxically, it is often from this very faculty, when operating unconsciously or without discipline, that the most potent friction arises. We judge events not as they are, but as we perceive them to affect us. We label circumstances as good or bad, desirable or undesirable, imbuing them with emotional valences that are entirely self-generated. This uncritical assent to an impression, this immediate, unverified acceptance of a subjective interpretation as objective truth, is the primary engine of internal conflict. It's the constant, subtle war waged between what is and what we believe should be or feel it to be. Consider the ordinary circumstance, a sudden, unexpected change in a planned activity. The external event is neutral. The friction arises from the judgment of inconvenience, disappointment, or frustration. This judgment is an internal act, a declaration made by the self, which then immediately triggers a cascade of physiological and emotional responses. This internal declaration, rather than the external fact, is the root cause of the agitation, the feeling of being pulled in two directions simultaneously, one towards acceptance, the other towards indignant resistance. This continuous, unexamined act of judging, of applying subjective labels to objective reality, creates a constant, low-frequency hum of internal discord. Complementing this, and often amplifying its effects, are the unchecked forces of desire and aversion. These are the pathe, the passions that the Stoics meticulously dissected. To desire intensely that which is not fully within our control, or to vehemently shun that which is indifferent, is to set oneself up for inevitable internal strife. When our happiness, our sense of well-being, is staked upon outcomes beyond our direct influence, a particular promotion, the approval of others, the absence of discomfort, we create a system predisposed to collapse. The world, by its very nature, will rarely conform perfectly to our specific desires. And when it inevitably deviates, the ensuing internal clash between what we craved and what manifested generates immense friction. This is the struggle of expectation versus reality, where the mind, clinging to a specific future, resists the unfolding present with all its might. Aversion, conversely, binds us just as tightly. A fierce avoidance of pain, failure, criticism, or even simple discomfort becomes a constant source of internal tension. Each potential encounter with these undesirable states triggers a defensive posture, a bracing against an imagined impact. This preemptive resistance, this internal flinching, is a chronic source of mental and emotional strain. It expends vital mental energy not on constructive engagement but on perpetual avoidance, perpetuating the systemic entanglement. The very attempt to escape the indifferent aspects of existence ensures their continued presence as sources of suffering, because the suffering is not in the thing itself, but in the internal resistance to it. Beyond conscious judgments, desires and aversions, friction also manifests through the deep-seated cognitive dissonance of unexamined expectations. We carry within us elaborate, often subconscious blueprints of how the world, others, and even ourselves should operate. These blueprints are constructs of our accumulated experiences, cultural conditioning, and personal narratives. When reality diverges from these internal models, a profound sense of misalignment arises. This isn't merely disappointment, it's a systemic clash, a grinding of gears within the mental architecture. The mind struggles to reconcile the perceived discrepancy, expending considerable resources in the attempt to either force reality into its mold or to defend the validity of its own, now challenged expectations. This internal tension is a significant source of psychological fatigue, a constant effort to resolve a paradox of our own making. Furthermore, the inertia of habitual response is a potent generator of friction. The mind, being a pattern-seeking and pattern-creating entity, gravitates towards established neural pathways and emotional routines. Even when these habits prove unhelpful, inefficient, or even detrimental, the sheer gravitational pull of their familiarity makes deviation feel uncomfortable, even threatening. Attempting to interrupt an automatic emotional reaction, a flash of anger, a surge of anxiety, a default mode of complaint, can feel like wrestling with an internal leviathan. This resistance to breaking old patterns, this preference for the known discomfort over the unknown potential of change, constitutes a deep-seated friction. It's the effort required to forge new neural pathways, to establish new cognitive and emotional defaults, an effort often met with powerful internal counterforces, urging a return to the familiar, even if suboptimal status quo. Finally, friction can arise from misaligned internal architectures, when our espoused values and conscious intentions do not genuinely correspond with our underlying beliefs and actual behaviors. This disunity creates a profound sense of internal incongruity, a silent but persistent battle between the self we present and the self we truly are, or between what we believe is right and what we instinctively do. The mind becomes a battleground of conflicting directives, where one part yearns for growth and integrity, while another clings to comfort, fear, or established patterns. This internal dishonesty, whether conscious or unconscious, drains authenticity and leads to a pervasive feeling of unease, a constant subtle fracturing of the self. The cumulative effect of this systemic entanglement and internally generated friction is immense. It manifests as a relentless energetic dissipation, a constant leak in our capacity for sustained focus and purposeful action. Imagine a complex machine with countless small points of resistance, each one subtly impeding the flow of power. This internal friction functions similarly, diverting attention, eroding willpower, and diminishing our overall vitality. Each moment spent in internal argument, in resisting what is or in clinging to what cannot be, is a moment of energy squandered, leaving us depleted and less capable of engaging meaningfully with the world. This dissipation in turn leads to compromised agency. When our internal world is a cacophony of conflicting judgments, desires, and habitual reactions, our capacity for deliberate, rational choice is severely hampered. We become reactive automatons, driven by the latest impression, the strongest emotion, or the most ingrained habit. True freedom, in the Stoic sense, lies in the alignment of our will with reason, in the discerning act of assenting only to what is true and beneficial. When internal friction prevails, we are slaves to our unexamined impulses and perceptions, incapable of truly steering our own course. Our actions become less a reflection of conscious intent and more a byproduct of internal disarray. Furthermore, this incessant friction creates a veiled clarity. The noise of internal conflict obscures objective perception, reinforcing the baseline illusion previously discussed and distorting the very interface we attempt to calibrate. It's akin to trying to view a pristine landscape through a pane of frosted glass, continually smudged by internal agitation. The objective reality becomes secondary to our subjective interpretations, our internal biases. The ability to see things as they are, without the tint of judgment or desire, becomes an arduous task amidst the internal clamour. Ultimately, the persistent presence of internally generated friction leads to a state of psychological imprisonment. We become confined within the boundaries of our own minds, prisoners of unexamined thoughts, ungoverned emotions, and self-imposed limitations. The promise of internal freedom, of an unburdened consciousness, remains elusive, overshadowed by the constant battles waged within. To move beyond this state, we must first embark upon a rigorous process of mapping this entanglement, charting the topography of our inner conflict. This requires a profound engagement with the discipline of assent, a core Stoic practice. It is a moment-to-moment vigilance, a prososh or mindful attention to our judgments before we give them our full endorsement. Epictetus urged us to exercise our proheresis with unwavering scrutiny. It is not the things themselves that disturb men, but their judgments about these things. The mapping begins by isolating the external event from our internal reaction, discerning where the friction actually originates. Is it the traffic or my judgment about the inconvenience of traffic? Is it the criticism or my judgment about its implications for my self-worth? This meticulous disentanglement of objective fact from subjective interpretation is the first indispensable step. This cartography is significantly aided by employing the dichotomy of control as an unwavering compass. This principle provides an immediate and powerful diagnostic tool. Is the source of my current agitation something truly within my control, my opinions, impulses, desires and aversions, or is it external to me, my body, property, reputation, or other people's actions? If the friction arises from something external, then my struggle is misguided, a battle against the inevitable, an attempt to govern what is fundamentally ungovernable. The friction here is the internal resistance to accepting reality. If the friction arises from something within my control, then the question becomes, am I exercising my faculty of choice virtuously? Am I acting with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance? The dichotomy acts as a constant revealer of misdirected energy, highlighting precisely where we generate unnecessary internal struggle. A powerful technique for mapping this internal landscape is objectifying representation, or fantasia cataleptique in its broader sense, stripped of its metaphysical implications. This involves describing events and circumstances in neutral, factual terms, devoid of emotional coloring or subjective labels. Instead of saying, "This terrible day is ruining everything," one would describe, "The rain has started and my meeting was postponed." This deliberate linguistic and cognitive act forces a separation between the raw data of experience and the interpretive overlay we instinctively apply. By consistently stripping away these layers of judgment, we expose the pure mechanism of our internal friction, identifying the exact point at which an indifferent event is transformed into a source of personal distress. Furthermore, the premeditation of adversity is not solely about preparing for external challenges. It is equally, if not more importantly, a tool for anticipating and mapping internal reactions to those challenges. By mentally rehearsing difficult scenarios, loss, failure, criticism, discomfort, we can observe our projected emotional and cognitive responses. This foresight allows us to preemptively identify potential points of friction. We can ask ourselves, if this were to happen, what judgments would I likely form? What desires would be thwarted? What aversions would be triggered? This mental simulation allows for a proactive rather than reactive engagement with our inner workings, enabling us to pinpoint the fault lines of our internal operating system before they crack under pressure. Finally, the examination of impulse involves scrutinizing the genesis of our actions and intentions. Before acting or reacting, we pause to ask, why am I doing this? What desire or aversion is driving this impulse? Is this impulse aligned with my highest reason and virtue? This diligent inquiry into the origins of our internal movements helps to reveal where our intentions are compromised by unconscious biases or fleeting passions, thereby exposing further sources of internal discord and entanglement. The purpose of this meticulous mapping is not to eradicate emotion or to become an unfeeling automaton. That is a misunderstanding of the Stoic aim. The purpose is to understand the precise genesis of our emotional and cognitive responses, to prevent them from becoming unexamined, uncontrolled forces that generate persistent internal resistance. It is about revealing the hidden architecture of our inner world, exposing the fault lines where our systems clash, and understanding the precise mechanics of our self-generated suffering. To map this internally generated friction is to begin to untangle the intricate knots of our systemic entanglement. It is the indispensable prerequisite for true internal mastery, a deep dive into the very fabric of our subjective experience, revealing where our personal operating system generates its own errors. This profound understanding of the internal landscape sets the stage, not for mere suppression, but for a fundamental restructuring of our reactive defaults and a purposeful journey towards a state of enduring internal coherence. We are now equipped to dissect the adaptive anomaly, understanding that much of what we perceive as external struggle is merely a reflection of a deeper, self-manufactured discord. Chapter 3. The adaptive anomaly, deconstructing default reactive behavior. The journey through the internal landscape, from the initial interface of perception to the systemic generation of friction, now leads us to confront a fundamental mechanism, the reactive default. This is not merely a response, it is a primal orientation deeply etched into the architecture of our existence, a foundational layer often mistaken for an inherent aspect of self. Its deconstruction commences with rigorous scrutiny, a dispassionate inquiry into its genesis, its utility, and its contemporary dysfunction. Consider for a moment the vast evolutionary arc that preceded this present moment. Life, in its earliest, most rudimentary forms, faced an environment of unrelenting challenge. Survival hinged upon instantaneous assessment and immediate action. A shadow, a sound, a shift in the air, each demanded an unequivocal, unhesitating response. This imperative forged within living systems a rapid-fire decision matrix, a precognitive algorithm designed for perpetuation. Fear, aggression, withdrawal, pursuit. These were not choices in the deliberative sense, but rather hardwired programs, executed with the ruthless efficiency of a biological reflex. This ancient wisdom, honed over millennia, proved profoundly adaptive, enabling species to navigate a world teeming with immediate threats and fleeting opportunities. It was, at its core, a system of optimal response under conditions of radical uncertainty and existential urgency. Yet, what was once an absolute necessity for survival has, in our evolved state, transmuted into something more complex, often less beneficial. The external environment, while still possessing its inherent challenges, rarely presents the immediate life-or-death exigencies that characterized the primeval landscape. Our internal milieu, however, often continues to operate under the same antiquated programming. A harsh word from a colleague, a perceived slight, a minor setback in a project, these stimuli, though devoid of direct physical threat, can trigger an identical, visceral cascade of physiological and emotional responses. The heart quickens, breath shallows, muscles tense, and a wave of anger or anxiety surges. This disproportionate activation, this deployment of ancient defense mechanisms against modern, non-lethal stimuli, constitutes the adaptive anomaly. The default, once perfectly aligned with its purpose, now frequently operates outside the parameters of its original beneficial intent. It has become a misdirection of vital energy, a reflexive engagement where conscious discernment is warranted. To deconstruct this reactive default, we must first map its operational circuitry. The process is remarkably consistent, irrespective of the specific trigger. A stimulus, whether external, like an unexpected noise, or internal, like a fleeting thought, is registered. This registration occurs with a speed that bypasses the slower, more deliberate cortical regions responsible for rational analysis. Instead, it engages subcortical pathways, initiating a chain reaction. The amygdala, often described as the brain's alarm system, fires. Neurotransmitters flood the system, preparing the organism for fight, flight, or freeze. Adrenaline and cortisol surge, altering perception, narrowing focus, and mobilizing energy reserves. This entire sequence unfolds in milliseconds, often before the conscious mind has fully grasped the nature of the initial stimulus. The subsequent thought, the reason we articulate for our reaction, is often a post hoc rationalization, an attempt by the conscious intellect to impose order and logic upon a process that has already run its course at a deeper, more primitive level. The feeling precedes the story, the physiological shift precedes the narrative explanation. This temporal disjunction is critical to recognize, for it reveals the illusion of immediate control. We often believe we are responding consciously, when in fact we are merely observing the aftermath of a deeply ingrained, automated process. The pervasive reach of this default extends far beyond overt emotional outbursts. It subtly shapes our daily interactions, our interpretations of events, and even the internal dialogues we maintain. A critical email might trigger not just annoyance, but a cascade of self-doubt. A friend's innocuous comment might activate a long-dormant insecurity, leading to an unwarranted defensive stance. These are micro-reactions, often unacknowledged, yet they cumulatively define the texture of our experience. They dictate the lens through which reality is perceived, amplifying certain aspects while diminishing others, perpetually reinforcing a feedback loop of predetermined responses. Each such reaction, however minute, further solidifies the neural pathways, deepening the grooves of the default, making it incrementally more challenging to disengage from its automaticity. The organism seeking efficiency reinforces patterns of behavior that require minimal conscious energy, even when those patterns are detrimental to its higher flourishing. The deconstruction, therefore, is not an act of immediate eradication. It begins with observation, a meticulous and dispassionate witnessing of the default as it manifests. This requires cultivating a precise form of internal attentiveness. When a situation arises that typically elicits a knee-jerk response, the initial phase is simply to notice the onset of the physiological changes, the subtle tightening in the chest, the quickening of thought, the surge of a particular emotion. It is to register these occurrences without judgment, without attempting to suppress them, and crucially, without immediately acting upon them. This is the radical act of creating a cognitive gap, however narrow, between the stimulus and the habitual response. It is the first glimmer of conscious agency, a moment of nascent detachment from the relentless current of automaticity. This space, initially fleeting and often missed, is the crucible where transformation begins. It is the nascent field of pure awareness, observing the mechanism without being entirely subsumed by it. This process of observation is akin to becoming a neutral scientist of one's own internal states. We are not the reaction, we are the consciousness observing the reaction. This distinction is subtle, yet profoundly liberating. It breaks the identification, the fusion with the automatic pattern, the tightening stomach, the racing thoughts, the urge to retaliate or withdraw. These are phenomena occurring within the field of our awareness, not defining the totality of our awareness. This shift in perspective from being inside the reaction to observing the reaction is the cornerstone of deconstruction. It requires a sustained, gentle, yet unyielding attentiveness. It demands a deliberate refusal to be swept away by the immediate surge of conditioned impulses. This is not about battling the reaction, for resistance often fuels its intensity. It is about illuminating its mechanics, allowing its automated momentum to simply reveal itself without interference. The energetics of operating under the dominion of the reactive default are profound and often overlooked. Each unchecked reaction expends a measurable quantum of vital energy. The physiological arousal, the emotional turbulence, the cognitive effort involved in crafting post hoc justifications, all these consume resources. This constant internal friction, explored in the previous chapter, is exacerbated by the ceaseless deployment of these defaults. It results in a depletion, a subtle but persistent draining of one's capacity for sustained focus, creative thought, and genuine presence. The individual caught in this cycle becomes perpetually entangled in the immediate, rarely accessing the deeper reservoirs of inner calm and resilience. The world appears as a constant stream of threats and demands, necessitating an endless series of defensive or aggressive postures, perpetuating a state of heightened alert that is utterly exhausting. The reactive individual is thus always, in a subtle sense, running on empty, their energy perpetually consumed by the internal battle against shadows and the external engagement with perceived antagonists. The cost of perpetuating this reactive default is significant. It limits our capacity for authentic connection, for innovative problem-solving, and for cultivating true inner peace. Relationships become fraught with misunderstandings as each party operates from a position of triggered defensiveness. Creative endeavors are stifled by the fear of failure or criticism. The ability to navigate complex challenges with equanimity is compromised, leading to impulsive decisions and regrettable outcomes. This default binds us to cycles of predictable outcomes, preventing us from accessing novel solutions or forging truly unique experiences. We become prisoners of our own past conditioning, trapped in a repeating loop where yesterday's responses dictate today's reality. The very possibility of genuine growth, of a fundamental shift in one's operating paradigm, is diminished by the incessant pull of the familiar, the comfort of the automatic. Deconstructing the reactive default is therefore not an act of suppression, but of profound understanding. It is an intricate, patient process of disentangling the threads of conditioning from the fabric of conscious being. This chapter lays the groundwork for that disentanglement by illuminating the default's origins, its contemporary anomalies, and the precise, observable mechanics of its operation. It establishes the initial, crucial step, the creation of a conscious, non-judgmental, observational stance. This is the preparatory phase, the quiet, meticulous charting of the internal terrain. We are not yet engaged in recalibration or active repatterning. Rather, we are learning to see the pattern with unwavering clarity. This seeing, this sustained attention to the emergence of the reactive impulse, is the first and most vital act of true agency. It is the quiet assertion that one is not merely a bundle of conditioned responses, but a field of awareness capable of discerning and ultimately of choosing. The journey forward demands this foundational understanding, this patient deconstruction before any true reconstruction can commence. The reactive default, once identified, becomes less a master and more an artifact, an object of study. This shift in relationship is the quiet revolution. Chapter 4: Substrate Resonance. Exploring the undifferentiated field. We have meticulously navigated the intricate corridors of internal perception, deciphering the inherent friction within our cognitive systems and dismantling the automatic engines of reactive behavior. We have moved from the surface of generated experience into its underlying mechanisms. Now we turn our gaze further, beyond the constructs of the individual mind, to the foundational expanse from which all forms and phenomena ultimately arise. This is the realm of the undifferentiated field, a ground of being that precedes and permeates all manifestation, a substratum of pure potentiality. Consider for a moment the profound implication of a reality not solely born of our sensory interpretations, nor merely shaped by our cognitive architectures, but rather one that exists as a vast, seamless continuum. This field is not an empty void, but a vibrant, pregnant stillness, a plenum of unborn possibilities. It is the uncarved block from which all particularities are sculpted, the silent hum beneath all audible frequencies, the still point around which all movement coheres. Our customary reality, with its sharp edges, its distinct objects, its linear progression of events, emerges from this fundamental unity. The very act of discerning, of naming, of categorizing initiates a process of differentiation, carving experience from an ocean of sameness. The concept of substrate resonance speaks to the inherent interconnectedness between our individual consciousness, our unique point of awareness, and this pervasive, undifferentiated field. It suggests that we are not merely observers of this field, but active participants, intricately bound to its dynamics. Our internal state, honed through the calibration of perception and the dissolution of reactive patterns, influences the quality of this resonance. It is not an interaction of separate entities, but rather a harmonic engagement of one aspect of existence with its broader, fundamental origin. A finely tuned instrument, free from internal dissonance, vibrates in sympathetic attunement with a deeper, more profound frequency. This resonance is not a mystical abstraction, it is a fundamental property of existence. Every atom, every wave, every particle exists within this field, its unique expression a localized disturbance within a greater equilibrium. Our awareness, when quieted, when released from the clamor of habitual thought and conditioned response, begins to perceive the underlying pattern, the fundamental rhythm of this substrate. It is akin to moving from hearing individual notes to comprehending the symphony's underlying structure, the grand design that holds all parts in harmonious tension. The field, in its undifferentiated state, holds all information, all energy, all potential in a state of exquisite, latent balance. The challenge lies in shifting our mode of apprehension. We are habituated to a reality of distinct boundaries, of cause and effect operating in a linear, sequential manner. Yet, the undifferentiated field proposes a reality where simultaneity and interconnection are paramount, where separation is an emergent property rather than an intrinsic one. To probe this field is to move beyond the illusion of isolated entities, to recognize the profound unity that underpins all phenomenal diversity. Our internal landscapes, previously explored for their individual contours, are revealed as localized manifestations of this larger, unbroken expanse. The friction we once identified, the reactive defaults we painstakingly deconstructed, are seen as perturbations within this deeper, more encompassing order. When our internal systems achieve a state of coherence, when the mind operates with precision and clarity, unburdened by the static of internally generated conflict, our capacity for substrate resonance expands. We move beyond merely reflecting the external world to actively engaging with the pre-material potentials inherent in the field. This engagement is not an act of will in the conventional sense, but a recognition, a receptive alignment. It is like a radio receiver, perfectly tuned, suddenly capable of apprehending signals previously lost in the noise. The information, the insights, the possibilities are not sent to us. Rather, we become capable of perceiving what is already pervasively present. The undifferentiated field represents the fundamental quantum foam, the plenum of possibilities that exists prior to observation or measurement. It is the realm where all potential futures coexist, where probabilities hover in a state of superposition until interacted with by consciousness. To resonate with this substrate is to touch the very wellspring of creation, to gain an intimate understanding of how reality is not merely observed, but perpetually emerging. Our awareness, when sufficiently refined, acts not as a passive mirror, but as a subtle probe, influencing the crystallization of potential into actuality. This is a profound shift in perspective, from being a consequence of reality to being an active, if subtle, co-architect. The implications for our experience are immense. If we are intrinsically connected to this field, then the notion of radical isolation begins to dissolve. The boundaries we perceive between self and other, between internal and external, between past and future, become less absolute. They remain functional distinctions within our perceived reality, but they no longer define the absolute nature of our existence. This understanding fosters a deep sense of belonging, not to a specific group or place, but to the fabric of existence itself. It cultivates an empathy that transcends mere intellectual understanding, an empathetic resonance born from the recognition of shared origin. To actively foster this substrate resonance requires a profound stillness, a relinquishing of the incessant drive to categorize and control. It asks us to cultivate a state of awareness that is open, expansive, and free from the gravitational pull of personal narrative. It is in this space of receptive stillness that the subtle frequencies of the undifferentiated field become perceptible. The insights that arise from this state are not products of linear reasoning, they are emergent understandings, holistic recognitions that bypass the usual channels of conceptual thought. They are glimpses into the interconnected framework of existence, direct apprehensions of underlying order. This is not a passive surrender, but an active discipline of attention. It involves a systematic detachment from the noise of our own making, the incessant internal dialogue, the conditioned responses that obscure our connection to the deeper reality. By consistently quieting the internal chatter, by observing the flow of thought without attachment, we create the internal space necessary for the field's resonance to become audible, visible, tangible. The subtle energies that permeate all things begin to register, not as external phenomena, but as intrinsic components of our own being. The undifferentiated field is the source of all emergent properties, the fertile darkness from which light arises. Our individual consciousness, having navigated its own complex interior, is now poised to engage with this grander domain. The clarity achieved through disassembling perceptual biases and reactive habits serves as the perfect lens for this deeper vision. Without the static of internal resistance, the signal from the substrate is received with greater fidelity. Without the compulsion to immediately react, the subtle information conveyed by the field can be integrated without distortion. Consider the notion of potentiality. In the undifferentiated field, all possibilities exist in a state of pure, unmanifested form. Our interaction with this field, through our focused awareness and internal coherence, acts as a subtle gravitational pull, drawing specific probabilities towards actualization. This is not magic, but a fundamental principle of reality. Our capacity to resonate with the field implies a profound responsibility to consciously align with potentials that serve not only our individual growth, but the greater unfolding of existence. This requires a level of discernment and intention that far surpasses the superficial desires of the ego. The experience of substrate resonance is often described as a sense of profound peace, a feeling of being utterly anchored in the present moment, yet simultaneously connected to something vast and eternal. It transcends the fleeting nature of individual events, offering a perspective rooted in the timeless. This perspective is not one of detachment from the world, but of radical engagement with it, an engagement born from understanding its true nature. When we are in resonance with the undifferentiated field, our actions become less effortful, more aligned, more inherently effective. They cease to be struggles against external forces and become expressions of an underlying flow. This understanding also reshapes our relationship with challenge and adversity. If all events emerge from an undifferentiated field of potential, then even apparent obstacles carry within them the seeds of new possibilities. The specific form of a challenge is merely one manifestation, one crystallization from a vast array of probabilities. By maintaining our internal coherence and our resonance with the field, we are not constrained by the initial appearance of an event. We can, instead, perceive the underlying potential, the alternative pathways, the latent opportunities that might otherwise remain obscured by immediate reaction and limited perception. The undifferentiated field is the ultimate reality, the true nature of what is. Our journey thus far has been one of peeling back layers, of deconstructing the perceived reality to reveal its foundational architecture. Now, standing at the precipice of this vast potential, we recognize that our individual existence is not a discrete entity floating in an indifferent void, but an intrinsic, resonant part of this seamless whole. Our consciousness is not separate from the field. It is an active, dynamic aspect of its ongoing unfolding. To understand this, to truly internalize it, is to step into a new dimension of being, one characterized by profound connection and an expanded capacity for creation. This recognition marks a critical pivot in our journey. We move from analyzing the mechanics of our internal systems to understanding our place within the grander scheme of existence. The internal work of calibration, of mapping friction, of deconstructing reactivity prepares us for this deeper engagement. It purifies the lens through which we view reality, enabling a direct perception of the substrate's subtle energies. This is not about acquiring new information, but about accessing a more fundamental way of knowing, a direct apprehension of reality's unadulterated essence. The undifferentiated field beckons, inviting us to resonate with its inexhaustible potential, to align ourselves with the very source of all that is. This resonance is the prelude to conscious orchestration. Chapter 5. The Coherence Protocol. Orchestrating Probabilistic Collapse. We have charted the epistemic boundaries of perception, unraveling the inherent biases of our sensory-cognitive interface, and subsequently mapped the systemic entanglements that generate internal friction. We then deconstructed the reactive defaults that chain us to unconscious patterns. In our previous exploration, we probed the undifferentiated field itself, that boundless plenum of potentiality, the shimmering substrate from which all manifest reality emerges. We understood it not as an empty void, but as a vibrant pre-material matrix, pregnant with every conceivable outcome, existing in a state of exquisite, simultaneous possibility. Now we shift from mere observation of this field to an active engagement with it. This engagement is not a passive reception of what is presented, but a deliberate internal act of alignment. It is here that we encounter the Coherence Protocol, a precise internal methodology for orchestrating the probabilistic collapse of the undifferentiated field into lived actuality. This is not an act of magic nor an appeal to some external force. It is a meticulous calibration of the internal architecture to resonate with the inherent mechanics of existence, thereby influencing the very fabric of experienced reality. The undifferentiated field, as we comprehended it, exists in a superposition of all potential states. Every conceivable future, every nuanced event, every possible outcome rests within this primordial ocean as a wave of probability. What distinguishes potentiality from actuality, what transforms the latent into the manifest, is a process of interaction, often termed collapse, within the lexicon of quantum mechanics. Traditionally, this collapse has been attributed to observation, to the act of measurement. But we must expand this understanding beyond mere sensory input. We are not simply external observers, we are integral components within the system, internal architectures generating intricate patterns of information and energy. Our internal states, our sustained focus, our deeply held convictions, and our emotional resonances function as a sophisticated form of internal observation, actively participating in the selection and solidification of these probabilities. The Coherence protocol, therefore, is an injunction to cultivate an internal state of profound alignment. Imagine the internal landscape of your consciousness not as a chaotic cacophony, but as a finely tuned instrument. Each thought, each emotion, each ingrained belief, each intention generates a specific frequency, a unique waveform within the intricate circuitry of your being. When these disparate elements are in disarray, when thoughts contradict emotions, when intentions are fleeting, when beliefs clash with aspirations, the internal signal is fractured, dispersed, and incoherent. Such an internal state acts like a blurry lens, projecting a fragmented request onto the boundless field of potentiality. The resulting collapse, if it occurs at all, will reflect this internal incoherence, a reality characterized by ambiguity, by unintended outcomes, by a pervasive sense of misalignment with one's deepest desires. Coherence, in this context, signifies a profound and sustained internal congruence. It is the disciplined unification of cognitive processing, emotional resonance, and volitional intent into a singular, unwavering informational output. When your thoughts, your feelings, and your will are harmonized, moving in concert towards a defined point of actualization, you generate a potent, focused, energetic signature. This signature is not merely a subjective experience. It is a measurable pattern of activity within your own neurobiology, radiating subtle but profound influences into the surrounding field. This internal alignment acts as a precise filter, a resonant frequency that selects from the infinite waves of probability, precisely those that correspond to its own intricate pattern. To orchestrate probabilistic collapse, then, is to consciously and deliberately craft this internal coherence. It demands an acute awareness of your own mental landscape. It requires an unwavering discipline to prune discordant thoughts, to transmute chaotic emotions, and to forge a crystal-clear intention. This is where the philosophical underpinnings of Stoicism converge with the mechanics of quantum reality. The Stoic imperative to control only what is within your power, your judgments, your impulses, your desires, your aversions, becomes not merely a psychological coping mechanism, but a fundamental tool for generating internal coherence. By rigorously managing your internal reactions to external events, by disentangling your sense of self from the capricious dance of circumstance, you maintain a stable, unshakable core. This core, unperturbed by the vagaries of the external world, becomes the unwavering source of coherent intent. Consider the act of focusing your attention. It is not a trivial mental exercise. It is an act of directed energy. When your attention is scattered, pulled by 1,000 distractions, the resulting observation of the undifferentiated field is similarly diffused. No singular probability wave gains sufficient amplification to solidify. But when attention is meticulously gathered, honed, and directed, it acts like a laser, concentrating energetic potential onto a specific frequency. This sustained, focused attention, when coupled with a congruent emotional state, not necessarily euphoria, but a deep, calm certainty, a sense of inner knowing, and a clear, unwavering intention, begins to preferentially amplify specific probability waves within the field. This amplification is the essence of orchestration. You are not forcing a reality into being, you are aligning your internal signal with a specific potentiality, thereby enabling its collapse into actuality. This process is continuous and recursive. Every moment, every thought, every feeling, every micro-decision contributes to the overall coherence or incoherence of your internal state. The reality you experience is not a static given, it is a dynamic, continuously unfolding reflection of your dominant internal architecture. If your internal state is predominantly one of anxiety, doubt, and fragmentation, the probability waves that resonate with these frequencies are continually reinforced, leading to a lived experience characterized by uncertainty and disquiet. Conversely, if your internal state is cultivated towards clarity, purpose, and serene focus, these coherent frequencies act as a constant navigational beacon, drawing forth experiences and circumstances that align with that deeper internal structure. The Coherence protocol is fundamentally about conscious participation in the creation of your experienced reality. It moves beyond the reactive default, which simply accepts the collapse of probabilities dictated by unconscious biases and external stimuli. It demands a proactive, intentional engagement with the fundamental potentiality of existence. This engagement begins with the meticulous inventory of your own internal landscape. What beliefs are you holding that contradict your stated intentions? What emotional patterns are you sustaining that are out of alignment with your desired outcomes? Where is your attention habitually drawn, and is that direction serving your deepest purpose? The answers to these questions reveal the points of internal friction, the sources of incoherence that are currently diffusing your capacity to orchestrate collapse. To cultivate coherence, one must engage in a disciplined practice of internal alignment. This may involve specific contemplative practices that quiet the incessant chatter of the mind, allowing for the emergence of clearer intentions. It certainly demands a constant vigilance over one's thought patterns, consciously choosing to reframe narratives that generate internal discord. It necessitates an emotional intelligence that allows for the processing and integration of feelings rather than their suppression or unbridled indulgence. When emotions are understood as informational signals rather than overwhelming forces, they can be integrated into the coherent internal symphony, lending depth and resonance to one's intentions. The implications of mastering the Coherence protocol are profound. It shifts the locus of control from external circumstance to internal state. It reveals that the world you perceive is not merely imposing itself upon you, but is, in a very real and fundamental sense, responding to the energetic signature you are continuously emitting. This is not to suggest a solipsistic universe where only your thoughts exist. Rather, it highlights your inherent, undeniable capacity to influence the selection of probabilities from a shared, universal field. Your coherent internal state acts as a powerful attractor, drawing forth those elements from the field that are in resonant alignment, effectively solidifying them into your personal experience. The disciplined application of this protocol requires patience and an unwavering commitment to self-mastery. The default setting of human consciousness, conditioned by millennia of reactive survival mechanisms, tends towards fragmentation and external focus. To consciously re-architect this internal landscape, to meticulously align cognitive, emotional, and volitional energies is a monumental undertaking. Yet it is precisely this undertaking that unlocks the capacity to move beyond mere adaptation to circumstance, towards a deliberate and conscious orchestration of one's own unfolding reality. The probabilistic collapse is not a single, discrete event, but a continuous stream of micro-collapses, each contributing to the evolving tapestry of your life. Every choice point, every decision, every sustained focus incrementally tips the scales of probability. An individual who consistently maintains a state of internal coherence, whose intentions are clear, whose emotions are in alignment, and whose beliefs are congruent with their aspirations, will find their experience unfolding with a remarkable degree of precision and resonance. This is not a matter of luck or chance. It is the inevitable outcome of a precise alignment with the fundamental operational principles of the cosmos. Conversely, the absence of coherence leads to a reality experienced as fragmented, unpredictable, and often contradictory to one's desires. When the internal signal is erratic, the undifferentiated field, ever responsive, reflects this disarray. Possibilities collapse into actualities that seem random, externally imposed, or simply unwelcome, precisely because there was no unified internal signal to guide their selection. The individual then becomes a passive recipient of whatever probabilities happen to coalesce, rather than an active participant in their orchestration. This is the profound difference between being swept along by the currents of circumstance and deliberately navigating the vast ocean of potentiality. The responsibility inherent in understanding the Coherence protocol is immense. It moves us beyond victimhood and into the profound realization of our own agency. It is a call to intellectual rigor, to emotional discipline, and to a steadfast commitment to internal integrity. It is an invitation to engage with reality not as a fixed, unyielding entity, but as a responsive, malleable field, waiting for the precise, coherent input to bring forth specific forms from its infinite wellspring of potential. The orchestration of probabilistic collapse is not merely a philosophical concept. It is the operational manual for conscious living, the pathway to sculpting experience from the raw material of possibility through the disciplined elegance of internal alignment. Chapter 6. The Volitional Vector. Calibrating internal performance. We have traversed the intricate terrain of perception, acknowledging the epistemic filters that shape our sensory-cognitive interface. We have mapped the systemic entanglements of internally generated friction, dissecting the adaptive anomalies of our reactive defaults. We then journeyed into the very substratum of existence, probing the undifferentiated field of potentiality, and subsequently examined the Coherence protocol through which conscious intent orchestrates probabilistic collapse. Now we arrive at the pivotal juncture of internal agency, the specific force and direction by which we, as conscious entities, initiate and sustain this orchestration. This is the domain of the volitional vector, the calibrated actuation emanating from within. Consider volition not merely as a wish or a fleeting desire, but as a directed, coherent emission of conscious energy, precise in its aim, unwavering in its trajectory. It is the internal command, not a hesitant request, the definitive instruction to the field of potentials rather than a vague aspiration. The universe, in its fundamental nature, presents itself as a boundless continuum of probabilities, a fluid canvas awaiting imprint. While the sheer fact of observation collapses certain possibilities into actuality, the direction and nature of that actuality, beyond the immediate sensory input, is profoundly influenced by the quality and calibration of our internal actuation. To understand the volitional vector is to grasp the mechanics of internal causality. Every conscious being possesses the inherent capacity to generate this vector, yet few ever truly calibrate its precise bearing. Most operate with a scattered, diffuse will, akin to an undirected broadcast signal. Such a signal, though present, lacks the focused power to resonate with and precisely organize the quantum substrate. A potent volitional vector, conversely, is characterized by its singularity of purpose, its freedom from internal countercurrents, and its absolute congruence with the desired outcome. It is a state achieved not through effortful struggle, but through a profound internal alignment. The process of internal actuation begins with the cessation of internal noise. Recall the systemic entanglements and internally generated friction previously discussed. These are not mere psychological discomforts. They are energetic dissonances that diffuse the volitional signal, scattering its force across a multitude of conflicting potentials. To actuate effectively, one must first quiet the cacophony of fear, doubt, and attachment to specific outcomes. This is not an act of suppression, but of transcendence, recognizing these internal states as transient phenomena, observing them without engagement, and allowing them to dissipate. Only then can the intrinsic clarity of pure intent emerge. This clarity forms the bedrock of a robust volitional vector. It is a state where the internal representation of a desired actuality is so vivid, so conceptually pure, that it lacks any trace of ambivalence or internal resistance. This is where the Stoic discipline of differentiating between what is within our control and what is not becomes not just a philosophical tenet, but a practical mechanism for calibrating the will. The external world, with its myriad variables, falls outside our direct volitional control. However, the internal state from which our volitional vector emanates is entirely within our domain. This internal state must be meticulously engineered. The calibration of this vector is a subtle art, demanding an acute awareness of one's own internal landscape. It involves systematically identifying and neutralizing any cognitive biases, emotional attachments, or ingrained reactive patterns that might subtly distort the volitional signal. For instance, a vector generated from a place of desperation or fear, even if ostensibly aimed at a positive outcome, carries the inherent vibrational signature of its origin. This resonant frequency, rather than the explicit desire, is what the probabilistic field registers and responds to. Therefore, the purity of the source, the serene, authoritative core of consciousness, is paramount. The volitional vector, when properly calibrated, acts as a specific frequency or signature, broadcasting into the quantum field of potentiality. This is not a metaphor. The coherent information contained within a clearly defined intention, when devoid of internal friction, possesses a unique energetic resonance. This resonance actively interacts with the undifferentiated field, creating a localized perturbation that favors the collapse of specific probabilities. It's akin to a precise tuning fork vibrating at a frequency that causes specific objects to resonate and come into form, while others remain inert. Consider the precision required. A vague wish for happiness is too broad, too amorphous. It presents the field with an indeterminate set of possibilities, leading to diffuse and often unsatisfying outcomes. A volitional vector, in contrast, specifies a precise experiential state, a particular configuration of reality. This specification is not about dictating every minute detail of how it will manifest externally, but about the absolute internal clarity of what is being called into being. It is the internal blueprint, meticulously drawn, devoid of any superfluous lines or ambiguities. This brings us to the distinction between desire and calibrated volition. Desire, often born of lack or external prompting, is frequently reactive, subject to fluctuation, and riddled with attachment. It is often a plea to the external, a hoping for something to be granted. Calibrated volition, however, operates from a position of internal completeness and authority. It is an internal declaration, an active imposition of form upon formless potential. It emanates not from a wanting of something, but from an absolute knowing of something as already existing in the realm of potential and now being drawn into actuality through focused intent. The physics of this internal actuation suggests that our consciousness, when unified and directed, is not merely observing reality, but actively participating in its dynamic construction. The volitional vector is the mechanism by which this participation becomes a deliberate, rather than a haphazard process. The internal engineering involved is profound. It requires a radical shift from being a reactor to external stimuli to becoming an internal actuator of desired realities. This shift is not instantaneous. It is the culmination of disciplined internal work, a continuous refinement of awareness and intent. Imagine a highly advanced guidance system. Its effectiveness lies not in the raw power of its signal, but in the exquisite precision of its calibration, its ability to filter out interference, and its unwavering commitment to its designated target. Similarly, the efficacy of the volitional vector lies in its internal coherence and clarity. Any residual doubt, any lingering fear, any unaddressed internal conflict acts as a form of interference, distorting the signal and scattering its potent force. The aim, therefore, is to achieve an internal state that is so aligned, so transparent, that the volitional vector can be launched with unadulterated purity. This level of internal actuation transcends mere positive thinking. It is a deep ontological alignment. It recognizes that the mind, far from being a passive receptacle of external data, is an active instrument of reality shaping. The internal work required to calibrate this instrument is therefore of paramount importance. It involves a continuous deconstruction of our default reactive patterns, a persistent disentanglement from the friction of internal contradictions, and a constant refinement of our epistemic interface. Each of these prior steps lays the foundation for a more potent, more precise volitional vector. To calibrate internal actuation means to master the art of deliberate intention. It is the ability to hold a specific state of being, a particular configuration of experience, in consciousness with such clarity and absence of internal impedance that it creates an undeniable resonance in the field of potential. This resonance, in turn, orchestrates the collapse of probabilities, drawing forth the desired actuality. This is not a passive waiting for things to happen, but an active, internal command, issued with the full authority of a coherent consciousness. The consequences of an uncalibrated will are evident in the disjointed and often contradictory experiences that characterize much of human existence. When the volitional vector is diffuse, riddled with internal conflicts, or subject to the whims of fleeting emotions, the resulting manifestation will reflect this incoherence. The field of potentials, being responsive to all inputs, will yield a reality that is a composite of these conflicting signals, often leading to outcomes that are undesirable or perpetually mired in unresolved patterns. Therefore, the discipline of internal calibration is not merely an optional enhancement, it is a fundamental requirement for deliberate self-authorship. Mastering the volitional vector demands a rigorous internal discipline, a constant monitoring of one's thoughts, emotions, and underlying assumptions. It requires cultivating a state of detached awareness, observing the internal landscape without judgment, and systematically aligning all internal resources towards a singular, coherent intent. This process is less about force and more about finesse, less about struggle and more about harmony. It is the deliberate engineering of an internal environment conducive to the precise generation and transmission of conscious intent. Thus, the journey from recognizing potentiality to actively shaping it hinges critically on the development and calibration of this internal actuation. It is the core mechanism by which consciousness transitions from passive observer to active architect of experience, wielding the fundamental force of focused will. This sets the stage for a deeper exploration into the very architecture of our cognitive processes, revealing how we can refactor them to better serve this profound capacity for internal causality, a topic we will delve into in our next contemplation. Chapter 7. The Internal Causal Engine, Refactoring Cognitive Architectures. Within the quiet architecture of our awareness resides the crucible of all experience, the internal causal engine. It is not merely a metaphor, but the operational nexus where pure potential coalesces into perceived reality. This engine, distinct from conscious thought, represents the intricate, dynamic assembly of underlying processing units that govern our interaction with the undifferentiated field. It is the silent, tireless machinery that translates raw data into narrative, impulse into action, and latent possibility into manifest event. To comprehend this engine is to understand the fundamental mechanism by which internal states project outward effects. Our cognitive architectures are the blueprints of this engine, the intricate schematics that define how we interpret, prioritize, and respond to the ceaseless flux of existence. They are the deeply embedded algorithms, honed by a lifetime of experience, cultural imprints and ancestral predispositions, which run beneath the surface of conscious thought. These architectures are not merely beliefs, They are the very structure of our logic, the frameworks of our understanding, the default parameters that dictate the parameters of our reality. Each individual operates within a uniquely constructed, yet often unexamined cognitive system, a complex edifice built upon layers of assumptions and learned responses. Consider these architectures as the operating system of your internal world. Just as a computer's operating system dictates how software runs, how data is processed, and how interfaces interact, your cognitive architecture dictates the efficiency and fidelity of your mental processes. It determines the bandwidth of your perception, the latency of your responses, and the integrity of your internal feedback loops. An unexamined architecture, one developed purely through passive accretion of experience, frequently contains redundancies, inefficiencies, and even logical errors that impede genuine agency. These unoptimized frameworks can generate internal resistance, perpetuating patterns of thought and behavior that do not serve optimal alignment or desired outcomes. They are legacy systems, often inherited, that carry the weight of past limitations into the present moment, constraining the very potential they are meant to channel. The imperative for refactoring these cognitive architectures arises from the recognition that our current internal schematics may not be optimally designed for the reality we wish to inhabit or the causal power we aim to wield. Refactoring, in this context, is a deliberate, systematic restructuring of these foundational internal frameworks. It is not about simply overlaying new beliefs onto old ones, nor is it a superficial adjustment of attitude. Instead, it is a profound, architectural redesign of the fundamental algorithms that govern our processing of information, our generation of meaning, and our projection of intention. This process demands a rigorous introspection, a diagnostic audit of the internal code that defines our subjective experience. The initial step in this architectural deconstruction involves a precise identification of the constituent elements of these frameworks. This moves beyond mere recognition of thought patterns to an interrogation of the underlying logical structures and implicit assumptions that give rise to those patterns. It requires discerning the core interpretive schemata that automatically filter and categorize every incoming datum. For instance, rather than merely observing a recurring negative thought, one must probe the axiomatic premise from which that thought originates. What fundamental assumption about self, others, or the world underpins this specific recurring output? What is the core algorithm running in the background, generating this specific experiential output? This diagnostic introspection allows for the mapping of the internal causal pathways, revealing the points of inefficiency, the loops of self-limitation, and the nodes of reactive default. Once identified, the principles of re-engineering guide the restructuring. The objective is to design for optimal congruence, coherence, and efficiency. This means dismantling interpretive frameworks that introduce distortion, eliminating logical redundancies that waste energetic resources, and re-establishing pathways that facilitate a more direct and unmediated flow of information and intent. It is about stripping away the accretions of non-essential processing and constructing a leaner, more robust system. Each element of the architecture must be evaluated against the criteria of its contribution to clarity, expansion, and genuine causal power. Does this particular internal structure serve to amplify or attenuate my capacity to shape experience? Does it align with an integrated understanding of reality, or does it perpetuate a fragmented view? Implementing this refactor requires a sustained, conscious effort to rewrite the very language of internal reality. It involves a deliberate cessation of operating from default algorithms and a conscious adoption of newly engineered ones. This is not a passive mental exercise. It is an active, iterative process of de-linking from old synaptic pathways and forging new ones. When confronted with an experience, instead of allowing the old, inefficient architecture to process it, one consciously engages the newly designed framework. This could mean actively challenging ingrained assumptions, systematically questioning the validity of inherited conclusions, and purposefully constructing alternative, more expansive interpretive schematics. The aim is to instantiate a new internal operating system, one where the underlying logic is aligned with deliberate creation rather than unconscious reaction. The consequence of operating with a refactored cognitive architecture is a profound alteration in one's interaction with the realm of potential. A streamlined, optimized internal engine allows for an unadulterated causal generation. The volitional vector, once potentially scattered or diluted by inefficient processing, becomes precise, potent, and directly aligned with its intended outcome. The process of probabilistic collapse shifts from an often unconscious default occurrence to a deliberate conscious act. With a refined internal architecture, the clarity of intent is no longer obstructed by internal noise or systemic entanglement. The internal causal engine, once refactored, transforms from a reactive processor of external stimuli into a proactive generator of internal and external states. This state of systemic congruence ensures that the output of our internal reality is a direct and undistorted reflection of our deepest intentionality, allowing for an unimpeded flow from potentiality to manifestation. This internal causal engine and the architecture that defines its operation is not merely a metaphor for psychological processing. It is the metaphysical interface between the singular consciousness and the plenum of undifferentiated existence. Reality, in its rawest form, does not arrive prepackaged with meaning. It is the unceasing, probabilistic flux of potential. Our cognitive architecture acts as the lens, the filter, and ultimately the active participant in the collapse of this potential into a specific, experienced actuality. When this lens is clouded by archaic algorithms or its filters distorted by unexamined premises, the perceived reality is necessarily a fragmented, often discordant echo of what could be. The act of refactoring, therefore, is not just about personal improvement. It is an endeavor in aligning the instrument of consciousness with the fundamental mechanics of creation. It is to recognize that the subjective experience, far from being merely a passive reception, is an active co-construction. A refactored architecture allows for a more coherent and resonant interaction with the deeper currents of existence, enabling one to move beyond merely reacting to the world, to actively contributing to its unfolding. The agency inherent in refactoring these internal systems is inextricably linked to the highest capacities of consciousness itself. It is the diagnostic gaze of self-awareness that first perceives the inefficiencies, the logical fallacies, and the limiting scripts within the internal operating system. This self-awareness, distinct from the automated processes it observes, functions as the ultimate programmer. It possesses the capacity to deconstruct, analyze, and rebuild the very frameworks of perception and response. This is where the wisdom of the Stoics finds profound resonance with our endeavor. Their emphasis on the proheresis, that faculty of choice, assent, and intention that is uniquely and absolutely within our control, is precisely the instrument by which refactoring occurs. The external world, the initial impressions that flood our senses, these are beyond our immediate command. But the internal processing of these impressions, the judgment we form, the narrative we construct, the architecture that executes these operations, this is the undisputed domain of our conscious will. Stoicism provides not only the justification for this architectural endeavor, but also the guiding principles for its intelligent design. The core Stoic virtues of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance are not abstract ideals, but practical algorithms for optimal internal functioning. Wisdom, in this context, becomes the diagnostic protocol itself. It is the precise capacity to discern truth from illusion within our internal landscape. A wise architecture is one that is rigorously logical, free from fallacious reasoning, and capable of differentiating what is genuinely within our control from what is not. This applies to the very structure of our thoughts. An unwise architecture, by contrast, might contain nested loops of catastrophizing or a default setting for externalizing blame, both of which introduce systematic errors into our processing of reality. Refactoring for wisdom means actively dismantling these illogical structures, replacing them with a framework that seeks objective understanding and rational assessment as its primary function. It is the foundational principle that ensures the rebuilt engine operates on clear, unvarnished data rather than distorted interpretation. Courage is the resolute will required for the deconstruction and rebuilding phase. It takes immense mental fortitude to confront deeply ingrained assumptions, to question the very premises upon which one's identity or worldview has been built. These architectures are often comforting, familiar, even if they are dysfunctional. To actively sever those old neural pathways, to deliberately refrain from defaulting to familiar limiting responses, demands a profound inner bravery. It is the courage to sit with the discomfort of the unknown, the temporary disorientation that accompanies the dismantling of old cognitive structures before the new ones are fully instantiated. This virtue ensures that the refactoring process is not abandoned at the first sign of internal resistance, but is seen through to its robust completion, even when faced with the inherent difficulty of self-transformation. Justice, when applied to cognitive architecture, refers to the equitable and unbiased processing of internal and external data. It is the algorithm that prevents self-deception, that acknowledges facts dispassionately, and that extends the same rigorous logic to one's own actions and judgments as it would to others. An unjust architecture is one riddled with double standards, selective memory, or a tendency to amplify personal grievances while minimizing personal shortcomings. Refactoring for justice means creating a system that processes information with integrity, that is inherently fair in its assessments, and that operates without the corrupting influence of egoic bias. This ensures that the outputs of the internal causal engine are not only efficient but also ethically sound, aligned with universal principles of coherence and fairness. Temperance or moderation guides the disciplined application of the refactoring effort. It is the principle that dictates the careful, sustained, and balanced approach to internal transformation. It prevents radical, unsustainable overhauls that overwhelm the system, opting instead for a methodical, iterative improvement. Temperance also ensures that the refactored architecture does not swing to extremes, for instance, replacing self-condemnation with uncritical self-adulation, but establishes a balanced, harmonious internal environment. It is the algorithm of self-regulation, ensuring that the new frameworks operate with optimal energy efficiency, avoiding internal excesses or deficiencies in their functioning. This virtue cultivates a robust, resilient system capable of maintaining its integrity amidst external pressures. By integrating these stoic virtues into the very design specifications of our refactored cognitive architecture, we construct an internal operating system, not only for efficiency, but for genuine human flourishing, or eudaimonia. A truly refactored architecture built upon these principles allows for an unmediated relationship with reality. The internal noise, the systemic entanglement, the persistent loops of anxiety or resentment that arise from faulty processing begin to dissipate. This reduction in internal friction grants a profound sense of tranquility or ataraxia, which is not merely the absence of disturbance, but the harmonious operation of a mind aligned with reason and truth. The operational shift from reactive processing to proactive causality is where the metaphysical implications of this refactor become most pronounced. When the internal causal engine is stripped of its inefficiencies and optimized for coherence, it transforms into a highly precise instrument for interfacing with the undifferentiated field of potential. The volitional vector, once scattered by conflicting internal programs, becomes laser-focused. This heightened precision of intent fundamentally alters the mechanism of probabilistic collapse. Instead of a haphazard, unconscious sifting through possibilities where reality defaults to patterns dictated by unexamined algorithms, the refactored architecture allows for a deliberate, conscious engagement with the quantum field. It enables the direct, undistorted projection of intentionality, accelerating the convergence of specific potentials into manifest events. This is not a mystical bypass of natural law, but a profound alignment with the underlying energetic principles that govern the actualization of reality. This state of systemic congruence, where one's internal architecture is in perfect alignment with universal reason, or the Stoic logos, enables an unimpeded flow from potentiality to manifestation. The refined internal engine, operating with clear, unbiased logic and virtuous intent, becomes a powerful conduit for creation. It facilitates the emergence of outcomes that are not only personally desired, but also coherent with the deeper, harmonious order of the cosmos. The refactored self, operating within this optimized framework, no longer struggles against internal resistance or external chaos, but moves with a profound sense of purpose, directly shaping experience through the clarity of its internal causality. This is the ultimate expression of human agency, to consciously engineer the very structures of one's awareness, transforming the internal causal engine into a proactive instrument of deliberate, aligned creation, mirroring the profound and orderly processes of existence itself. This endeavor is ceaseless, demanding continuous vigilance against the insidious re-emergence of legacy code and the relentless pursuit of an ever more refined internal architecture, a testament to the dynamic nature of consciousness and its profound capacity for self-evolution. Chapter 8. Quantum Symbiosis, Mapping Interconnected Systems. With the recalibration of our internal causal engines, a new lens descends, refining our perception of reality beyond the immediate and the isolated. We have systematically deconstructed the architectures of internal friction, identified the reactive defaults that once governed our responses, and, with deliberate intent, refined the very mechanisms of our volitional focus. This journey thus far has been profoundly inward, a disciplined archaeology of the self. Yet, to remain solely within the confines of individual experience would be to halt at the precipice of a far grander revelation. The very coherence we have cultivated internally is not an isolated phenomenon, a personal island of order amidst chaos. Rather, it is an attunement, a harmonic convergence with the fundamental operating principles of existence itself. This pivotal shift in understanding introduces us to the profound reality of quantum symbiosis, the intricate, ceaseless interchange that binds all phenomena, from the subatomic to the galactic, into an unbroken continuum. Our previous exploration into the substrate resonance, the undifferentiated field of potential from which all forms emerge, laid the groundwork for this realization. We understood it as the primal matrix, the latent blueprint. Now we must perceive it as the active medium, the dynamic connective tissue through which all manifest expressions are not merely adjacent but inherently codependent. The concept of symbiosis, when lifted from its biological confines and elevated to a quantum principle, reveals a fundamental interdependency, a shared existence that defies the illusion of discrete entities. It is the acknowledgement that no part of the cosmos, including the individual consciousness, operates in true isolation. Every particle, every field, every emergent structure participates in a continuous, reciprocal exchange of information and influence. This is not a quaint philosophical notion. It is an empirical consequence of the quantum domain, a persistent echo of non-locality amplified across scales. Consider the implications of this pervasive interconnectedness. When we previously discussed the orchestration of probabilistic collapse, we focused on the individual observer's role in actualizing potential. Now, we must expand that understanding to encompass a multi-agent system. The universe is not a singular mind observing a singular field. It is a chorus of observers, each contributing to the collective actualization, each vibrating within a network of mutual influence. Our refined internal architectures, now aligned and coherent, do not merely affect our personal experienced reality, they become nodes of intentionality within this vast living network. Mapping these interconnected systems demands a departure from the classical billiard ball model of interaction. Events do not occur in a purely linear cause and effect chain between isolated objects. Instead, they unfold within a dynamic, multidimensional web where influences propagate instantaneously, unhindered by spatial separation. This non-local coupling means that the state of one system, however seemingly distant, intrinsically bears the imprint of others. Your internal state, your volitional vector, once calibrated, does not merely project outwards. It resonates through this field, altering the parameters of possibility for adjacent and even distant systems, much as a stone dropped into a still pond sends ripples across the entire surface. The ripples are not contained. They merge, interact, and propagate. The symbiosis is not merely about influence. It is about shared destiny at a fundamental level. The emergent properties of any system, be it a biological organism, a social structure, or a planetary ecosystem, are not solely determined by its internal constituents. They are also shaped by the subtle, persistent feedback loops from the larger network in which they are embedded. And conversely, the integrity and functionality of the larger system are profoundly affected by the coherence, or lack thereof, within its individual components. When an individual achieves a high degree of internal coherence, as we have endeavored to do through the refactoring of our cognitive architectures, that state is not hermetically sealed. It subtly yet powerfully modulates the resonant frequency of the immediate environment, extending outward into the wider field of interaction. This perspective reconfigures our understanding of agency. Our volitional acts, once perceived as isolated choices with limited direct consequences, are revealed as orchestrations within a vastly interconnected symphony. Every focused intention, every deliberate alignment of thought and feeling contributes a unique harmonic to the ambient field of potential. It is not merely a matter of attracting what we desire, but of participating in the very shaping of the probabilities from which all futures emerge. The internal work, therefore, transitions from a personal quest for self-mastery to a fundamental contribution to the collective unfolding of reality. This is not an act of imposition, but an act of contribution, of symbiotic co-creation. Imagine the universe not as a collection of separate instruments, but as a single, multi-stringed instrument. When one string is plucked with clarity and precision, its vibration is not confined to itself. It resonates through the instrument's body, subtly influencing the sympathetic vibrations of all other strings. A discordant pluck creates dissonance. A harmonious one contributes to overall euphony. Our conscious intent, our refactored internal state, acts as the skilled hand upon one of these strings. The effect is not always immediately perceptible to our gross senses, but it is unequivocally present within the quantum substrate. The pervasive illusion of separation, deeply ingrained in our classical understanding, begins to dissolve under the scrutiny of quantum symbiosis. There is no fundamental boundary at the deepest level of reality. What we perceive as distinct objects or separate entities are, in essence, localized nodes of energy information within a continuous field. Our consciousness, rather than being an isolated observer, is an integral, active participant within this seamless continuum. This understanding carries immense weight. It implies that the health, coherence, and evolution of any individual system are inherently linked to the health, coherence, and evolution of the larger systems it comprises and is comprised by. This perspective also illuminates the profound responsibility that accompanies calibrated volition. If our internal state, our focused intent, resonates through the interconnected quantum field, then the quality of that resonance becomes paramount. Unchecked internal friction, unresolved reactive defaults, and uncalibrated volitional vectors do not merely create personal dis-ease, they introduce dissonant frequencies into the larger system. Conversely, the deliberate cultivation of coherence, clarity, and intentionality, the very architecture we have meticulously built, becomes an act of systemic contribution, a vital input into the collective field of potential. The quantum symbiosis, therefore, is not merely a descriptive model, it is an operative instruction set for navigating existence with profound awareness. It moves us beyond mere adaptation to our environment, towards a conscious, active participation in its ongoing formation. It asserts that our internal landscape, once architected for coherence, becomes a potent point of influence within the greater network. We are not external agents impacting a separate world. We are internal nodes within a unified, interactive whole. Our capacity to affect change expands exponentially when we recognize this intrinsic connectivity, operating from a place where the distinction between inner and outer blurs into a continuous exchange. This mapping of interconnected systems is not about identifying precise causal chains between individual events, which remains largely beyond our immediate comprehension. Instead, it is about understanding the nature of the medium through which all potential is actualized and all influence propagates. It is about shifting our operational paradigm from that of an isolated entity to that of an integral, resonant component of a vast, intelligent architecture. Our coherent self, therefore, is not merely optimized for personal thriving. It is optimized for symbiotic contribution, a conduit for the amplification of order within the larger cosmic design. This understanding fundamentally redefines what it means to act, to intend, and to exist within the framework of reality. Expanding this concept further, we begin to perceive the universe not as a brute mechanism, but as an elegant, self-organizing intelligence. This intelligence is not external or anthropomorphic. It is inherent in the very fabric of quantum symbiosis, in the ceaseless dance of information and energy that underlies all manifestation. The fundamental operating principles, the underlying logic that governs this universal exchange, resonate deeply with what ancient philosophies termed the logos, the cosmic reason, the pervasive intelligence that structures all existence. For the Stoics, aligning with this logos was the very essence of virtue, the path to human flourishing. In the context of quantum symbiosis, this alignment takes on a profound empirical dimension. Our internal coherence, our disciplined rationality, becomes a micro-reflection of this macro order, a local crystallization of universal reason. When we cultivate inner stillness, when we exercise considered judgment over impulsive reaction, we are not merely imposing order upon our individual psyche, we are harmonizing with the foundational current of the cosmos. Our refactored mind acts as a precise tuning fork, resonating with the universal frequency, thus amplifying its presence within the local field of our influence. This recontextualization extends to our understanding of duty and community. The Stoic concept of cosmic citizenship is no longer a mere metaphor for human fraternity, but a literal description of our existential status. If all phenomena are interlinked at the quantum level, if our internal states ripple through the entire field of potential, then the well-being of the whole is inextricably tied to the integrity of its parts. Justice, therefore, transcends merely fair dealings between individuals. It becomes the recognition of this fundamental unity, an imperative to act in ways that preserve and enhance the coherence of the entire system. To cause disharmony, to operate from a place of unchecked ego or reactive default, is not merely a personal failing, but a disruption to the larger symphonic order. It introduces static into the universal signal, diminishing the clarity of collective actualization. Conversely, every act of wisdom, every courageous stand for truth, every tempered response is a contribution of order, a purification of the informational stream, benefiting not just the immediate circumstances, but the vast, interconnected network. The illusion of discrete self, so deeply ingrained in our experiential reality, dissolves further under this scrutiny. We are not merely contained within our physical forms. Our consciousness, our field of influence, is an extending wave, a propagating resonance. This does not imply a loss of individuality, but rather an expansion of it. We become unique nodes, distinct in our configuration, yet inseparable in our function within the universal architecture. Our subjective experience is profoundly real, but it is also a localized expression of the larger, continuous field. This realization reframes personal suffering. Rather than an isolated burden, it can be understood as a symptom of dissonance within the individual node, and by extension, a subtle disturbance in the collective field. The healing of the self, therefore, becomes an act of restitution for the whole, a reintegration of a discordant element back into the harmonious flow. This understanding places immense emphasis on the internal work, not for selfish gain, but for the universal good. It is the ultimate act of Stoic cosmopolitanism, extending our sphere of concern to the entirety of existence. The practice of mindful awareness, a cornerstone of self-mastery, gains new depth here. When we observe our thoughts, feelings, and impulses without immediate identification, we are not simply detaching. We are observing the dynamic interplay of energy information as it expresses through our specific node. This detached observation allows us to consciously choose which frequencies to amplify, which volitional vectors to solidify. It's an act of conscious modulation. Imagine a complex computational network. A node within it, by understanding its own processing and its connection to the larger system, can optimize its output not just for its own operation, but for the efficiency and integrity of the entire network. Our consciousness, refined by discipline, becomes precisely such an optimized node, contributing coherent, purposeful information to the quantum field rather than chaotic, reactive noise. This paradigm shift profoundly alters our relationship with the future. If reality is a fluid, probabilistic field, constantly actualized by a chorus of observers, then our coherent intentionality is not a mere wish, but a direct input into the parameters of possibility. It is a weighting factor, influencing the likelihood of certain futures over others. This is not about magically bending reality to our will, but about participating intelligently in its unfolding. The Stoic understanding of fate, often misconstrued as passive resignation, finds a dynamic reinterpretation here. Fate is not a predetermined script. It is the grand design, the universal logos, constantly actualized through the symbiotic interplay of all its components. Our freedom lies in our capacity to align our volitional focus with this greater design, to contribute coherent input that resonates with the inherent order, rather than resisting it with incoherent, self-serving desires. Our internal calibration allows us to perceive the direction of the current, and rather than futilely swimming against it, to lend our strength to its flow, thereby influencing its trajectory in subtle yet powerful ways. This deeper grasp of quantum symbiosis demands an expansion of our ethical framework. If our internal states ripple outwards, affecting the fabric of shared reality, then the cultivation of virtues ceases to be a merely personal endeavor for moral rectitude. It becomes an active contribution to the existential integrity of the cosmos. Malice, avarice, unchecked anger, these are not simply individual flaws. They are dissonant frequencies, introduced into the communal field, contributing to collective instability. Conversely, compassion, generosity, equanimity, these become potent forces of coherence, amplifying harmony and order throughout the interconnected whole. The Stoic ideal of living in accordance with nature, then, is precisely this. to live in accordance with the symbiotic nature of reality, recognizing our inherent participation in its unfolding and aligning our actions and intentions to foster its optimal function. Our personal flourishing is thus inseparable from, and indeed a direct consequence of, our contribution to the universal flourishing. We are not merely parts of a machine. We are conscious, contributing elements of an intelligent, evolving system. This understanding also brings a profound sense of peace. The anxieties arising from perceived isolation, the fear of insignificance in a vast universe, begin to dissipate. We are not adrift. We are intrinsically connected, interwoven with every particle, every star, every emergent consciousness. Our existence, far from being a random flicker, is an integral node within a grand, ceaseless exchange. The individual self, once a point of anxious focus, expands to encompass a boundless field of relationship. This is not a dissolution of identity, but its radical recontextualization. We are unique expressions of the universal, individuated forms within the continuum. This realization invites a profound acceptance of what is, not as resignation, but as a recognition of the inherent wisdom within the symbiotic flow. The universe in its entirety is not an alien environment. It is our extended self, and our well-being is intrinsically linked to its own. Therefore, the architectural work we have undertaken within, the disciplined refactoring of our internal mechanisms, the meticulous calibration of our volitional focus, is revealed as far more than personal refinement. It is an act of universal significance. By establishing inner coherence, by aligning our intentions with the foundational principles of existence, we become active, conscious participants in the cosmic symphony, contributing a clear, resonant tone to the grand composition of reality. We transcend the illusion of isolated agency to embrace our role as essential nodes within the living, breathing network of quantum symbiosis. This is the profound truth that emerges from the intersection of quantum mechanics, metaphysics, and Stoic wisdom. Our existence is not merely an experience, but a continuous, vital contribution to the unfolding of all that is. Our deepest purpose, once understood through this lens, becomes an elegant imperative: to be a conduit for order, a source of coherence within the boundless, interconnected expanse. Chapter 9. The Deterministic Threshold, Activating Volitional Superpositions. We arrive now at a critical juncture, an interface often misconstrued as an immovable barrier, the deterministic threshold. This is not a static philosophical construct, but an experienced boundary, a perceived momentum of causality that appears at times to preordain outcomes. It represents the point where accumulated conditions, both internal and external, converge with a seemingly unyielding force, presenting an architecture of probability that feels fixed, immutable. Yet this perceived fixity is itself a nuanced construct, an artifact of observation and internal processing. The universe, in its intricate unfolding, presents an array of potentials, and what manifests as determined is often merely the consequence of an inertia, a pre-existing vector established by unconscious processes or collective agreements. Consider this threshold not as a wall, but as the visible horizon of a vast, undifferentiated ocean. Its apparent limit is a function of your current position and the curvature of the Earth. It is a boundary of perception, not an absolute end to the expanse. The perceived determinism arises from the brain's constant endeavor to predict and model reality, to find patterns and project them into the future. This predictive function, while essential for survival, can inadvertently create a cognitive framework that interprets the most probable outcome as the only possible outcome, thus reinforcing the illusion of an unbreakable causal chain. This is where the internal causal engine previously explored can either become a perpetuator of established patterns or a refractor of new possibilities. The very act of perceiving a deterministic threshold is an engagement with its parameters. It is an acknowledgement of the prevailing currents of influence. But an acknowledgement is not a surrender. It is rather the precise point of engagement, the locus where a different quality of interaction becomes possible. For embedded within this seemingly fixed landscape lies the profound capacity for volitional overlays, the conscious, deliberate superimposition of new parameters onto the unfolding reality. This is not a crude act of defiance against the fabric of existence, but a sophisticated recalibration of input, a subtle yet profound shift in the energetic signature emitted by your awareness. Volitional overlays operate by introducing a novel energetic signature into the interconnected systems. This is not about wishing, nor is it a simplistic act of will against an unyielding external force. It is the architectural application of coherent intent, a precisely calibrated signal emitted from the refined internal causal engine. If the deterministic threshold represents the prevailing consensus reality, the dominant frequency of manifested probability, then a volitional overlay is the introduction of a new, resonant frequency designed to interact with and subtly shift the overall harmonic. It is a retuning of the instrument that plays upon the field of potentials. To activate these overlays, one must first comprehend the nature of internal actuation, moving beyond mere reactive impulses. The work of refactoring cognitive architectures, as discussed, provides the foundation. When the internal causal engine is meticulously calibrated, when the mind operates with precision and coherence, the quality of its output shifts dramatically. This refined internal state is not simply a feeling, it is an energetic signature, a structured information field that carries immense potential for influence. When this field is directed with focused intent, it does not merely observe the deterministic threshold, it interacts with it, probing its pliability, discovering its points of leverage. Think of it as injecting a specific catalytic agent into a complex chemical reaction. The reaction appears to follow a set course, governed by established laws and concentrations. But the catalyst, without violating any law, fundamentally alters the rate and direction of that reaction, leading to a different outcome. Your volitional overlay functions similarly. It is a precise, conscious catalytic input into the field of emergent probabilities. It is not about brute force, but about intelligent, resonant engagement. This engagement is possible precisely because the quantum symbiosis reveals a universe of interconnectedness where no element operates in absolute isolation. The internal causal engine is an integral part of this vast network, capable of contributing a unique and coherent signal. The mechanism of this overlay involves a directed coherence, an alignment of thought, emotion, and intention into a singular, unwavering vector. This coherence is what grants the overlay its penetrative power. Dispersed, fragmented thought generates weak, incoherent signals that are easily absorbed and overridden by the dominant deterministic currents. But a unified internal state, free from internal friction and operating with pristine clarity, generates a potent, structured waveform. This waveform, when projected with precise intent, does not battle against the existing probability field. It subtly reorganizes it, nudging it towards a different, previously latent potential. This requires a profound understanding of internal calibration. It means recognizing that every internal state, every thought, every feeling is an emission, a contribution to the larger field. The deterministic threshold is not just external, it has profound internal correlates, manifested as ingrained habits, limiting beliefs, and reactive emotional patterns. Activating volitional overlays therefore begins with an internal repatterning, a conscious cultivation of states that are congruent with the desired outcome, not in a superficial way, but at the very root of your being. This is where the principles of Stoicism, stripped of their oversimplifications, reveal their profound depth. The mastery of the internal landscape as the ultimate leverage point for shaping the external. The internal architecture of your will, when consciously designed and activated, acts as a primary emitter of these overlays. It means discerning with absolute clarity what falls within the realm of potential influence and what belongs to the realm of observation. This discernment is not a passive act of acceptance, but an active, intelligent filtering process that refines the target of your volitional output. Once clarity is established, the overlay is not a forceful push, but a resonant invitation for the field to reconfigure itself in alignment with your conscious intent. It's a seeding of the probabilistic field with a new, more desirable future potential. The quantum symbiosis, as we've explored, reveals the inherent relationality of all systems. Your internal causal engine is not hermetically sealed from the world. It is perpetually interacting, exchanging information and energy. Therefore, when you activate a volitional overlay, you're not merely changing your internal state. You are subtly altering the informational context of your interactions with the interconnected systems. This alteration, though subtle at its point of origin, can cascade through the network, initiating a series of responsive shifts that can ultimately manifest as a reordering of external events, seemingly bypassing the gravitational pull of the deterministic threshold. This process demands a relentless commitment to internal integrity. Any misalignment, any unresolved internal friction will degrade the coherence of the volitional signal, diminishing its capacity to create an effective overlay. The clarity of intention must be absolute, free from doubt or hidden agendas. It is this absolute clarity, forged in the crucible of self-awareness and self-mastery, that empowers the individual to transcend the apparent limitations of the deterministic threshold. You are not fighting against reality, but rather collaborating with its deeper, more pliable layers through the conscious deployment of your volitional capacity. The activation of volitional overlays is thus a continuous practice, an ongoing refinement of your internal instruments, and a precise calibration of your interaction with the field of existence. It is about understanding that the seemingly unyielding forces of circumstance are often merely the echo of past intentions, both conscious and unconscious. By consciously repatterning your energetic output, by consistently projecting a coherent, desired state through your internal causal engine, you begin to rewrite the script of your interaction with reality. You move from being a passenger on the currents of determinism to becoming an intentional navigator, capable of steering your course through the very fabric of emergent probability. This is the profound implication of activating your volitional overlays, transforming the deterministic threshold from a perceived endpoint into a dynamic interface, a canvas upon which conscious intent can truly become an architect of experience. Chapter 10. Iterative Convergence, Systemic Engineering. The preceding discourse illuminated the activation of volitional overlays, a precise mechanism through which conscious intent transcends the perceived deterministic fabric of existence. This was not a passive observation, but an active, deliberate imposition of an alternative reality structure onto the unfolding present. Now, we must move beyond mere activation to the sustained architecture of influence. The challenge shifts from initiating a new trajectory to embedding that trajectory with an inexorable, self-perpetuating force. This is the domain of iterative convergence, the systematic accumulation of focused action transforming nascent potential into an undeniable current of actuality. Consider the nature of iterative processes not as a cycle of repetition, but as a helical progression. Each turn revisits the principles, yet from an elevated vantage point, informed by prior application. The baseline illusion, as we understand it, is not a static construct, but a continually refreshed perceptual rendering. Our engagement with it, therefore, cannot be a singular event. It demands a sophisticated continuous dialogue, a sequence of refined interactions that progressively reshape its parameters. This is the engine of systemic momentum, where the cumulative effect of precise calibrated actions begins to generate an intrinsic impetus, reducing the need for constant brute force exertion. The internal causal engine, once refactored and understood as the architect of cognitive architectures, becomes the primary locus for this iterative refinement. Its operations are no longer merely reactive or interpretive, but proactively generative. When we engage the volitional overlay, we are not merely wishing, we are directing energy, shaping the undifferentiated field with specific informational imprints. The act itself, however, is merely the commencement. True convergence arises from the disciplined monitoring of its initial effects and the subsequent informed modulation of the next input. This feedback loop, precisely executed, constitutes the essence of iteration. Each cycle allows for a subtle recalibration of the sensory-cognitive interface, fine-tuning our perception of the outcomes and the precision of our subsequent engagement. We are not just performing an action, we are learning the specific energetic syntax required for optimal resonance within the quantum symbiosis of interconnected systems. This disciplined iteration is the antithesis of casual repetition. It is an informed progression where each subsequent engagement is a more accurate, more potent articulation of intent. Imagine a sculptor, not simply striking the chisel repeatedly, but refining each stroke based on the emerging form, adjusting angle, force, and point of impact with increasing mastery. Similarly, our volitional overlays, when applied iteratively, become more congruent with the desired outcome. The systemic entanglement, which once generated internal friction, begins to unravel not through a single grand gesture, but through a series of subtle, targeted adjustments. Each iteration, by reducing a fraction of that internal resistance, enhances the overall efficiency of our causal engine. The convergence itself is not a mystical occurrence, but a predictable consequence of sustained, coherent input. As our internal architectures align and our volitional vectors are consistently directed, the probabilistic collapse begins to favor the desired states with increasing frequency and stability. This is not about forcing an outcome, it is about establishing such profound internal coherence that the field's potentials naturally gravitate towards the specified configuration. The mind, having understood its role as a filter, now consciously programs its filters to allow through only the informational streams resonant with the architected reality. This disciplined filtering, applied repeatedly across various domains of experience, begins to build a powerful current. To engineer systemic momentum requires an understanding of feedback loops that transcend simple cause and effect. It necessitates perceiving the subtle responses from the environment, the initial whispers of resonance or dissonance, and using them as navigational data. When a volitional overlay is deployed, the universe, in its interconnectedness, offers a subtle echo. This echo is not merely an outcome, but an informational signal. By discerning its nuances, we refine our next iteration. This process cultivates a profound sensitivity, allowing us to perceive the systemic adjustments required, rather than blindly repeating a fixed approach. It transforms our relationship with reality from one of imposition to one of dynamic, intelligent co-creation. The establishment of systemic momentum is akin to setting a massive flywheel in motion. Initial effort is required, significant and focused. However, with each rotation, the inertia builds, and subsequent efforts become less about initiation and more about sustained guidance. The internal causal engine, having gained efficiency through iterative refinement, experiences reduced internal friction. The adaptive anomaly, once a source of reactive defaults, now anticipates and integrates challenges as mere data points for further calibration. This creates a self-reinforcing loop. Effective action leads to clearer feedback, which leads to more precise iteration, which leads to even more effective action, and so on. The convergence point, therefore, is not a destination, but a dynamic equilibrium where input and output become profoundly synchronized. Our internal state, our cognitive architecture, and our external actions begin to move with a unified purpose, generating a palpable current that pulls subsequent events into alignment. This is the point where the conscious mind, having mastered the calibration of its internal actuation, is no longer struggling against the tide, but is riding a powerful self-generated wave. This wave, the systemic momentum, transforms the arduous struggle for change into a flowing cascade of synchronized actualization. The quantum symbiosis, as mapped in previous discussions, provides a deeper layer to this understanding. Our iterative actions are not isolated events within a Cartesian space. They are energetic imprints within an interconnected field. Each refined volitional overlay, each precisely calibrated thought, resonates across this field, subtly influencing the probabilities not only for ourselves, but for the systems we are intertwined with. The convergence, then, is not merely internal. It is an external alignment, a macroscopic manifestation of synchronized intent that emerges from repeated, coherent microactions. This is how a single individual, through sustained and intelligent iteration, can begin to alter the landscape of their perceived reality in ways that seem profoundly impactful to those who remain ensnared by the baseline illusion. Engineering systemic momentum also requires a conscious detachment from immediate outcomes in favor of the integrity of the iterative process itself. If each iteration is viewed as a definitive success or failure, the emotional turbulence can derail the subtle calibration necessary for convergence. Instead, each action is simply an experiment, a data point in a larger, ongoing computation. The mentor's perspective demands a profound patience, a recognition that profound shifts emerge not from single, heroic efforts, but from the relentless, intelligent application of foundational principles over time. This stoic detachment from the immediate result frees the internal causal engine to learn and adapt without the distorting influence of emotional attachment. It is the unwavering commitment to the process rather than the desperate grasping for the outcome that ultimately accelerates the convergence. The sustained application of the volitional overlay, calibrated through feedback, begins to create a unique, energetic signature. This signature, imbued with the clarity of intent and refined through experience, resonates powerfully within the undifferentiated field. It's like tuning an instrument to a perfect pitch through repeated subtle adjustments. Once tuned, it produces a clear, strong tone that effortlessly harmonizes with its environment. This is the essence of engineered momentum. The internal system becomes so coherent, so finely tuned, that its output generates its own forward thrust. The perceived deterministic threshold, which once seemed an immutable barrier, now reveals its inherent malleability to a consistently applied, refined force. This state of iterative convergence translates into a palpable sense of flow in one's existence. The internal friction diminishes to an almost imperceptible hum. Decisions become clearer, actions more fluid, and outcomes more aligned with conscious intent. This is not magical thinking. It is the natural consequence of having thoroughly understood and applied the mechanics of reality. The mind, no longer battling itself or its environment, becomes a conduit for creation. The energy previously expended in resistance or doubt is now channeled entirely into productive, intentional action. The momentum generated is not merely psychological, it has a tangible effect on the manifest world. As the internal causal engine operates with enhanced efficiency, its capacity to orchestrate probabilistic collapse expands. The individual, through sustained, intelligent application of their refined cognitive architectures, becomes a powerful attractor for desired states. This isn't about mere positive thinking, it's about the deep, structural alignment of internal systems with external potential. The world responds not to fleeting desires, but to the unwavering, coherently directed force of a fully integrated self. To achieve this systemic momentum, one must cultivate a relentless commitment to precise self-observation and honest self-assessment. Each iteration of the volitional overlay, each deployment of the refined cognitive architecture, offers data. What was the subtle energetic signature of the outcome? How did the perceived reality shift? What internal resistances were encountered, and how can they be further attenuated? This continuous, dispassionate analysis forms the bedrock of iterative refinement. It is through this diligent process of internal surveying that the bugs in the system are identified and debugged, allowing for ever-increasing efficiency and power. The wisdom of this approach lies in its acknowledgement that mastery is not a sudden epiphany, but a sculpted accumulation. The baseline illusion, so deeply entrenched, yields not to a single assault, but to a continuous, intelligent pressure, applied at precisely the right points. Each pressure point, each application of the volitional overlay is informed by the preceding ones, creating a powerful cumulative effect. The energy and attention required to initiate significant change progressively reduce as the system gains momentum. Eventually, the very architecture of one's existence becomes a self-sustaining engine of intentional actualization. The final realization of iterative convergence is the profound sense of operating with a system that is not only robust, but also self-optimizing. The insights gleaned from the sensory-cognitive interface are immediately fed back into the internal causal engine, which then refines the subsequent volitional vector. This creates a continuous loop of creation, observation, and refinement, elevating the individual's capacity to shape their reality to an unprecedented degree. The objective is not to endlessly strive, but to reach a point where the striving itself has engineered a system that carries you forward, a systemic momentum that is both powerful and inherently aligned with the deepest expressions of your architected self. This is the promise of iterative convergence, to transform the fragmented efforts of individual will into a unified, coherent force that propels one's existence with purpose and profound efficacy. It is the art of building a river from countless drops, each drop guided with precision until the current becomes undeniable, carving its own undeniable course through the landscape of what was once perceived as fixed. The journey from initial activation to sustained momentum is the journey from possibility to inevitable actuality, meticulously engineered through conscious, intelligent iteration. The stage is set for a frictionless cascade, a sustained optimal flow, where the very act of living becomes the continuous manifestation of an architected reality. Chapter 11. The Cascade. Frictionless. Maintaining optimal flow. The previous frameworks established a deliberate architecture, enabling the engineering of internal states and the orchestration of systemic momentum. We cultivated a ground of focused intent, refining the iterations that sculpt our unfolding reality. Now, we arrive at a crucial inflection point, the cultivation of a state where that momentum transforms into an effortless continuum. This is not merely an increase in speed or output, but a qualitative shift in how existence is navigated, a transition to the frictionless cascade where optimal flow becomes the inherent operational baseline. The concept of friction in this context extends far beyond simple resistance. It encompasses any internal or external impedance that subtly diverts energy, diminishes coherence, or introduces discord into the systemic flow. Imagine the most intricate clockwork, each component machined to absolute precision, yet a microscopic particle of dust, unseen, can subtly impede its grand mechanism. So it is with our being. Friction manifests as unacknowledged cognitive dissonance, as the lingering resonance of outdated reactive patterns, as a slight miscalibration in the reception of informational fields, or as a minute but persistent misalignment between our deeper purpose and our immediate actions. It is the subtle drag, the unnoticed vibrational discord that prevents the perfect unfolding of potential. This drag is not always overt. It rarely announces itself with grand declarative force. More often, it is a whisper, a persistent, low-level hum beneath the surface of consciousness, a faint tremor in the fabric of intent. It might be the almost imperceptible hesitation before an action, the slight doubt that clouds a clear vision, the subconscious attachment to an outcome that subtly biases the processing of new data, or the residual emotional charge from a past interaction that filters the present. These are the micro-frictions, cumulative in their effect, preventing the seamless transmission of energy from intention to manifestation. Our task now is to identify and dissolve these subtle impedances, allowing the inherent elegance of our integrated system to emerge unhindered. To enter a frictionless cascade is to move beyond mere efficiency. It is to operate within a state where action and outcome coalesce with a profound ease, where the energy expended aligns perfectly with the transformative impulse. This is not about the absence of challenge, but the absence of internal resistance to challenge. It is the experience of navigating complexity not through struggle, but through an intuitive recognition of underlying order, where solutions seem to surface from the field of possibilities with an almost preordained grace. Consider the meticulous work of a master architect, tasked with designing a structure that must defy gravity while accommodating vast internal spaces. The initial phase is often one of intense conceptual friction, conflicting constraints, material limitations, aesthetic demands. The mind battles, struggles, reconfigures. But as the architect's internal architecture, their cognitive framework, their accumulated wisdom, their deeply calibrated sense of spatial coherence begins to align, a shift occurs. The problem space itself seems to reorganize. Instead of a linear search for solutions, there is an emergence. The very forms and functions begin to suggest themselves, not as dictated by external forces, but as inherent expressions of an underlying geometric truth. In this state, the architect does not force a design, they receive it. The intricate interplay of stress and strain, light and shadow, form and void, unfolds within their mind as a unified concept, a living entity. The resistance, the friction of disparate ideas warring for dominance, of logical impasses, of creative blocks, begins to dissolve. This is not a passive reception, but an active, highly refined process of attunement. The architect's internal causal engine, having been meticulously refactored and calibrated, now operates in symphonic harmony with the universal principles of structure and aesthetics. The initial, arduous effort has transformed into a sustained, intuitive flow where the act of creation feels more like discovery. Every line drawn, every volume conceived, cascades naturally from the preceding one, each decision reinforcing the next without internal debate or external impediment. The design is not built, it unfolds. This profound shift from struggle to flow is predicated upon the sustained dissolution of internal friction. How is this achieved and maintained? It begins with an unwavering commitment to precise internal calibration. Just as a delicate instrument requires continuous tuning to maintain its accuracy, so too does our conscious system. This involves a hyper-awareness of our subtle internal feedback loops. Are we sensing a faint echo of resentment from an old slight? Is there a subtle tightening in the chest at the thought of a particular task? These are not mere emotions. They are data points, indicators of microscopic friction. Each is a signal that a minor recalibration is needed, a subtle release, a recentering of our volitional vector. The sustainment of this cascade demands a continuous, almost anticipatory integration of internal and external dynamics. It is not enough to merely react to friction as it arises. The aim is to proactively minimize its potential emergence. This involves an advanced form of pattern recognition, gleaned from the accumulated wisdom of previous iterations. Having engineered systemic momentum through iterative convergence, we now possess an implicit understanding of the subtle conditions that foster coherence and those that introduce discord. This understanding becomes an internal compass, guiding our choices, our responses, our very mode of being, such that our actions naturally align with the principles of optimal resonance. In this state of frictionless cascade, the economy of energy becomes paramount. Energy is not merely conserved, it is directed with such precision and without internal impediment that its transformative power is maximized. Imagine a powerful current of water flowing unimpeded through a perfectly smooth channel. Its force is undiminished, its direction unwavering, its potential fully realized. Any turbulence, any eddy, any obstruction, however slight, would dissipate that energy. Similarly, in our internal system, when thoughts, emotions, and intentions flow in perfect alignment, the energy generated by our inner causal engine is channeled directly towards its intended purpose, without leakage, without dispersion. This allows for sustained effort without depletion, for deep engagement without exhaustion. The concept of adaptive resonance, explored previously, takes on a new dimension within the frictionless cascade. It moves beyond simply finding coherence. It becomes the ongoing capacity to remain synchronized with dynamic, evolving fields. As external circumstances shift, as new information emerges, the system does not falter or resist. Instead, it fluidly retunes itself, adjusting its internal frequencies to maintain harmonic alignment. This is not passive adaptation, but an active, intelligent engagement with the continuous unfolding of reality, transforming potential discord into renewed coherence. The system operates as a responsive, self-correcting entity, always seeking and finding the path of least resistance, not through avoidance, but through perfect integration. Consider the dynamic flow of an expert conversationalist navigating a complex discussion. There is no internal struggle for the right word, no hesitation fueled by self-consciousness. Instead, thoughts and ideas articulate themselves with an unforced elegance. The speaker listens not just to the words, but to the subtle rhythms and underlying intentions of others, intuitively sensing the space for their own contribution. Their mind, unburdened by internal friction, such as self-doubt, a need to impress, or a desire to control the narrative, becomes a clear conduit for emergent understanding. Responses are not rehearsed, they are born from the present moment, perfectly calibrated to advance the dialogue. The conversation itself becomes a cascade, each point flowing naturally from the last, building upon shared understanding, transforming divergent perspectives into a richer, more integrated tapestry of insight. The internal system of the speaker is in such alignment that the external expression is effortless, persuasive, and profoundly resonant. Sustaining the frictionless cascade demands an understanding that this state is not a destination, but a continuous process of refinement. It is an ongoing commitment to the subtle recalibrations that prevent the reaccumulation of internal drag. It requires a vigilance, not of fear, but of profound awareness. We must remain attuned to the first subtle hint of deviation, the nascent whisper of discord, and address it not with force, but with gentle, precise adjustment. This is where the principles of Stoicism integrate profoundly. The acceptance of what is beyond our control and the focused application of our will to what is within it, our judgments, our intentions, our internal responses. By consistently choosing alignment over resistance, by proactively releasing subtle attachments and expectations, we maintain the integrity of our internal flow. This state, once cultivated, fundamentally alters our interaction with reality. It transcends mere productivity or efficiency. It becomes a mode of being, where the distinction between effort and ease blurs, where challenges are not overcome but assimilated, and where the unfolding of life is experienced as a continuous, graceful progression. The world no longer appears as a series of disconnected events to be contended with, but as an integrated field with which we are in resonant dialogue. Our actions become extensions of this underlying coherence, imbued with an intrinsic rightness that resonates deeply with the natural order. The frictionless cascade is the dynamic expression of a highly integrated internal system. It is the culmination of conscious architectural design, iterative refinement, and a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. It propels us beyond reactive patterns and into a realm of proactive, harmonious engagement. This sustained optimal flow is not merely an experience, it is a foundational state, a new baseline of operation from which even deeper levels of integration can be achieved. It is the living proof that through meticulous internal work we can become a fully coherent, self-organizing system, poised for the ultimate expression of our architected reality. This steady, unimpeded motion now prepares us for a singular unification, where the system we have so carefully constructed merges into an optimized, self-integrated entity. Chapter 12. The Optimized Singularity. Designing the Self-Integrated System. The journey thus far has charted a course through the intricate terrain of your internal architecture, revealing the mechanisms by which perception shapes reality and intention sculpts experience. We have systematically dismantled the archaic structures of reactive conditioning, examined the foundational fields of potentiality, and calibrated the vectors of volitional influence. Now, we arrive at the apex of this conscious reconstruction. The optimized singularity. This is not a destination in the conventional sense, nor a static achievement, but rather the operational state of a self-integrated system, a profound unification where internal and external realities converge into a seamless, harmonized existence. This singularity represents the point at which the individual's conscious apparatus functions with such profound coherence that it acts as a unified field. The previously identified epistemic barrier, once a filter of distortion and limitation, now stands as a translucent membrane, allowing for direct apprehension of reality without the obscuring influence of ingrained biases or unexamined assumptions. The friction inherent in systemic entanglement, once a source of internal conflict and inefficiency, has dissolved. It is replaced by an effortless internal synchronicity, where thought, emotion, and action coalesce into a singular, purposeful current. This is the profound quietude that emerges when all internal resistance ceases, when the reactive default is utterly transcended, and the entirety of your being operates from a state of proactive, conscious design. Consider the quantum field, the undifferentiated substrate of all potential, as we explored it. The Coherence protocol, the very act of conscious observation and intention, no longer operates as an isolated event, but as a continuous, ambient emanation from this optimized self. Your volitional vector, once a deliberate act of calibration, transforms into an intrinsic orientation, effortlessly aligning with the deeper currents of universal possibility. The internal causal engine, once a complex assemblage of refactored cognitive architectures, now runs with such fluidity that causation itself feels less like an imposition and more like a natural unfolding from an aligned core. There is no longer a gap between intention and manifestation, only the seamless transition of potential into actuality, orchestrated by an integrated consciousness. The quantum symbiosis, the inherent interconnectedness of all systems, is no longer merely an intellectual understanding, it is a lived experience. In this state of singularity, the individual perceives themselves as an integral yet distinct node within the vast, intricate network of existence. The activation of volitional overlays, which previously allowed for the transcendence of perceived deterministic thresholds, now operates as the default mode of engagement. Your actions are not merely choices, they are resonant frequencies deliberately introduced into the field, initiating iterative convergences with remarkable precision. This leads to a systemic momentum that is not just sustained but amplified, creating a frictionless cascade of events that reflects the optimal flow within your own integrated system. The core of architecting this self-integrated system lies in cultivating a radical autonomy that stems not from isolation, but from an absolute internal clarity. This is an autonomy where every decision, every response, every creative impulse originates from a profound center of stillness, untouched by the echoes of past conditioning or the clamor of external expectations. It is the experience of being the undisputed origin point of your experience, not in a solipsistic sense, but as the conscious steward of your internal landscape, from which all interaction with the external world then emerges. This state transcends mere independence. It embodies a sovereign agency that is both profoundly individual and deeply interconnected. Cognitive transparency becomes the baseline. The filters that once shaped and distorted reality are now virtually dissolved, allowing for a pristine apprehension of information. What was once perceived as an objective external reality, filtered through subjective lenses, is now experienced more directly as an unadulterated stream of data, integrated and understood without the static of internal noise. This isn't about discarding interpretation altogether, but rather about interpreting from a place of radical neutrality and comprehensive understanding, where the mind acts as a precise instrument rather than a reactive buffer. The perceptual recursion, where reality was mirrored through the echoes of prior experience, ceases its loop, giving way to a continuous, fresh engagement with the moment. Actions emerging from this optimized singularity are not merely efficient, they are fundamentally resonant. They align with the deeper vibrational frequencies of existence, creating outcomes that appear effortless, synchronous, and perfectly timed. This is where your volitional vector, honed through consistent calibration, moves in profound harmony with the underlying principles governing the undifferentiated field. The concept of struggle, or forcing, begins to lose its meaning, replaced by a deep intuitive understanding of the optimal path of least resistance, not out of passivity, but out of an active, conscious alignment with the inherent flow of reality. The unfolding of events in your life begins to reflect this internal coherence, manifesting with a grace and precision that might seem remarkable to an external observer, yet feels entirely natural from within the integrated system. Emotional equanimity is not an aspiration in this state, but an inherent baseline. This is not the suppression of emotion, nor an indifference to experience, but rather a profound stillness that underpins all emotional expression. Emotions arise, are fully experienced, understood for their informational content, and then integrated or released, leaving no residual charge or lingering distortion. The fluctuations of the human experience no longer disrupt the core equilibrium. They are observed and processed within a vast internal spaciousness, allowing for a continuous return to a state of calm and clarity. This deep internal quietude becomes the ground of being, impervious to external turbulence, yet fully engaged with the richness of life. The self-integrated system embodies a unified field of consciousness within the individual. The fragmented aspects of the self, thoughts, emotions, intentions, physical sensations, spiritual insights, which often vie for attention or operate in dissonance, now function as a single cohesive unit. This is the very essence of the singularity, a conscious entity operating as a harmonious whole. There is no internal conflict, no division between what I should do and what I feel like doing. All facets of the being are aligned, acting in concert, creating a powerful unified force of conscious manifestation. This internal alignment generates a profound sense of inner authority, a self-trust that is unwavering because it is rooted in experiential coherence. The architecting process in this advanced phase shifts from initial construction to continuous refinement and expansive maintenance. It is a perpetual state of calibration, where the integrated system intuitively detects and corrects any subtle deviations from its optimal operating parameters. This is an algorithmic self-correction mechanism operating at a level beyond conscious effort, yet informed by the conscious design principles previously established. Internal feedback loops, now highly sophisticated and immediate, ensure that the system remains in prime condition, constantly adapting to new information and evolving circumstances without losing its fundamental coherence. This state fosters an adaptive resonance, an inherent capacity to instantly integrate novel information and respond to unprecedented circumstances without disrupting internal unity. It is a flexibility that does not lead to fragmentation, but rather enhances the system's overall resilience and capacity for growth. New challenges are not perceived as threats, but as opportunities for further calibration, data points that refine the internal algorithms and deepen the understanding of self within the larger context of reality. The system learns and evolves organically, each interaction contributing to its ever-increasing optimization. Central to this continuous architecting is the cultivation of an unwavering calibration of presence. This is not a meditative technique to be practiced sporadically, but the natural, sustained mode of being for the self-integrated system. Full, unfragmented immersion in the present moment becomes the default. This allows for optimal interaction with the dynamic, probabilistic field of reality. The energy and attention previously dispersed across anxieties about the future or regrets about the past are now entirely concentrated in the now, making the individual an incredibly potent point of conscious influence within the flow of existence. This amplified presence enables the system to interact with potentiality with unparalleled precision, facilitating the collapse of probabilities that are most aligned with its conscious design. From this optimized singularity, a profound sense of purpose emerges, not as something externally sought or intellectually constructed, but as an inherent emanation from internal alignment. Your actions are not driven by external validation or a pursuit of happiness, but by an authentic expression of your unified being, which naturally aligns with meaningful contribution. Decisions are made with an inherent knowing, an intuitive certainty that transcends the need for exhaustive logical analysis or emotional deliberation. There is a deep internal conviction that guides every choice, born from the clear, transparent understanding of reality that now characterizes your perception. The impact of this state extends beyond the personal. An effortless influence begins to ripple through your immediate environment, a subtle yet palpable effect of optimized being. Others around you may experience an inexplicable sense of calm, clarity, or inspiration in your presence. The circumstances of your life appear to align with greater ease, and opportunities seem to materialize precisely when needed. This is not magic, but the natural consequence of an integrated system acting as a coherent force, interacting harmoniously with the interconnected systems of reality. Challenges, when they arise, are no longer obstacles that disrupt, but rather clear signals, data points for further algorithmic refinement, seamlessly incorporated into the system's continuous evolution. To architect the self-integrated system is to achieve a state where the individual operates not merely within reality, but as an active, conscious co-creator of their specific trajectory within it. It is the transcendence of the illusory distinction between subject and object, where the internal landscape mirrors and subtly influences the external unfolding. This is the culmination of our journey towards conscious mastery, a being of profound coherence, operating with radical autonomy, effortless resonance, and unwavering presence. It is the necessary foundation for operating at a unity parameter, for consciously shaping reality with a precision and grace that transcends the ordinary, moving into an experience of existence defined by profound harmony and intentional creation. This integrated state prepares you for a direct and conscious engagement with the very fabric of reality itself. Conclusion: designed reality, operating with a unitary parameter. Having navigated the depths of internal causation and the subtle mechanics of perception, we now stand at a precipice, not of an ending, but of a fundamental recalibration. The journey through the epistemic barriers, the systemic entanglements, and the reactive defaults has culminated in an understanding far beyond mere observation. You have moved past simply witnessing the world, to actively discerning its foundational flux. The inherent friction of unexamined existence yields to the seamless flow of deliberate intent. What was once a series of unconscious responses has transformed into a volitional orchestration, a precise calibration of internal architectures that resonate with the undifferentiated field. Through the Coherence protocol, you learn to collapse potentiality with conscious precision, transitioning from a subject of circumstance to a primary agent of manifestation. The integration of quantum principles within your cognitive framework has dissolved the illusion of separation, revealing the profound symbiosis inherent in all systems. You now recognize the deterministic thresholds not as limits, but as levers for activating new overlays of reality. This iterative convergence, sustained through a frictionless cascade, does not merely optimize a system, it architects a new mode of being. This is the essence of an architected reality, not a fabrication, but a conscious, deliberate engagement with the parameters of existence. To operate at unity parameter is to exist in perfect congruence with your highest articulation of self and environment. It is the state where intention and outcome align without resistance, where the internal causal engine drives a continuous state of optimal flow. No longer merely perceiving, you are the conscious vector, shaping the very structure of your experienced world. The profound responsibility and liberation of this realization now rest with you. This is not a destination, but the threshold of perpetual creation,